years of strategy and struggle against the prison industrial complex. It's a collection of essays. This one is by David Gilbert on page 31, titled "The System Within the System, the Prison Industrial Complex and Imperialism." For those of us held behind locked gates within the walls and fences topped with razor wire, the corrections regime is the system that works tirelessly to impose total control over every aspect of our lives. Yet as ponderous and powerful as prisons are, they're only one part, a central girder, of a much bigger and more foreboding house of horrors, which can most accurately be named imperialism. The structural needs of the larger edifice set the specifications for the size and position of the girder. The strength of the girder helps determine how long the building itself will stand. We can't understand the explosion of imprisonment in the United States since 1971 without looking at an imperialism's urgent needs and goals of that period. By the same token, we can't develop an effective program around the prison industrial complex without grappling with the stresses and trends of the larger system of imperial rule. To be clear, before you take time to read this chapter, I don't offer any brilliant ideas on strategy. Those will most likely emerge from the organizing and activist efforts themselves. However, some of the concerns discussed may raise questions that go into forming strategy. I definitely look forward to learning from the dialogues that this generates on these issues. Imperialism may sound like the kind of rhetoric we want to avoid, but it's one word that needs to be rescued as the best way to name the system that rules over us. The basis of imperialism is the relentless quest for profits around the globe. Its most striking characteristic is the colossal and grotesque polarization of wealth. That polarization happens between nations, between the rich countries of the North and the impoverished ones of the global South, the impoverished countries of Africa, Latin America, and parts of Asia, and at the same time within each country based on class, race, and gender. The poles of dazzling wealth and abject poverty are intimately linked, as the former results from the ruthless plunder of the latter. This system is built on and intensifies all the major forms of oppression: patriarchy, capitalism, and white supremacy, all of which are structurally central. At the same time, imperialism highlights the global character of the system in a way that explains why the most intense oppression and resistance have been in the South, and that also provides the context for why the liberation struggles of the various people of color have been in the forefront within the U.S. There's no way to capture what the system costs in human life and potential, the pain and loss for all of us. Close to 1 billion human beings suffer chronic hunger, while another 2 billion face nutritional deficiencies. 1 billion lack access to clean drinking water. Just looking at children under the age of 5, imperialism is a holocaust in progress. Over 9 million die every year from easily preventable causes associated with poverty. The price for future generations may be even more severe as the rapaciousness of this global frenzy for profits threatens the very ecological basis for sustaining human life on any scale on our planet. Since most people won't accept living in squalor amid plenty, imperialism entails both the most sophisticated and the most brutal forms of social control. Its most salient feature is war, war after war after war, mainly against the peoples of the South. The domestic front line of such repression is a truly violent and harmful prison industrial complex. Today, 2,300,000 people are held behind bars, about 7 times the number in 1971. That explosion was unprecedented, coming after a 70-year period when the rates of imprisonment had remained more or less constant. This dramatic change did not result from some sudden skyrocketing of criminal activity, but rather from a radical expansion of what was designated as a crime and a draconian increase in the punishments for those crimes. Such extreme measures were driven by considerations way beyond criminal justice and often at cross purposes to the proclaimed goal of public safety. These destructive changes were born from crisis, one much more severe and protracted than the periodic ups and downs of the business cycles that occur over a roughly 10-year period, but rather a situation that threatened the very survival of the system. Such structural crises occur because capitalism is by its nature unstable. The economy is vast and complicated, but the major decisions are made by a tiny corporate and financial elite, with each thinking only of his own profits. When a structural crisis develops, the long-term institutional arrangements that assured a reliable flow of profits and the rule of capital no longer function. One dramatic example was the Great Depression of the 1930s, followed by World War II. At the end of that period, a new set of international institutions, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, were created. At the same time, a new deal was hammered out for the terms of the bargain between capital and labor within the U.S. Those arrangements worked well for capital until they broke down a generation later. That new structural crisis, which emerged between 1968 and 73, is the seedbed for the burgeoning of the prison industrial complex and many related changes in U.S. history. The first and most obvious signs were political, as the resistance to imperialism crested in 1968. Abolition now. Hey, thanks so much for your support for the Thom Hartmann Program, along with your support for Free Speech TV. We deliver our program, of course, to commercial stations, which is how we pay our bills through the revenue from running advertising, and you can learn more about those at our website at thomhartmann.com. But we also share our program with non-commercial outlets, from Free Speech TV to Pacifica stations all over the country. And because with the Pacifica radio stations, there's basically no revenue coming in, the way that we support our nonprofit outreach is in large part through Patreon. And, you know, over at Patreon, people who support our program at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. People who support our program there get, you know, special little clips, and there's a few other goodies, behind the scenes kind of stuff. But that's principally, if you want to support the Thom Hartmann Program, that's the way to do it, is to get over to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann and check out what we're doing and support our program. Thank you.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you, broadcasting live today from the offices of The Nation magazine in New York City. And I'm so pleased to have sitting right next to me Katrina vanden Heuvel, the publisher of The Nation.
It's thrilling to. I'm so pleased you're here.
Set
up here to do your terrific radio show.
I'm so pleased you let us use your conference room, and what a cool place you've got.
You have behind you. I don't know if I don't know if people can see it. They will at some point. But you have the cover of the very first issue of The Nation, July 6, 1865.
Wow.
We're the oldest weekly, and the first line, Tom, is one we will not reprise today, but. The week was singularly barren of exciting events. Can you imagine launching a magazine with that buzzy statement?
In 1865.
In 1865, when in fact there were, coming out of the Civil War and into Reconstruction.
And Andrew Johnson.
There was some serious, I don't know, exciting, but there was tumult, as there is today in our republic.
Yeah, well, let's talk about our republic. I mean, you're at the nerve center here. I look around the offices, and you've got all these people sitting at computers working,
right.
And you've got reporters out in the field, and we're going to have a couple of your regular columnists on the program today. What is yours? The three big stories I think right now are Whitaker, and it turns out that it's looking more and more like he's kind of a right-wing crazy. I mean, he's one of these Breitbart guys, and the possibility of shutting down the Mueller investigation, right. The midterms that we just had.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear it, but I noticed that on one of the websites I read this morning that his rant this morning was particularly deranged. Apparently he was quoting like almost verbatim from Breitbart. So
I think we're in for a very dangerous time, because as Trump feels boxed in by the midterm outcome, I mean, taking back one house, the House offers some constraint on his unfettered power. He will do what he said, go into a warlike mode, and I think that's very dangerous, and I think it requires all of people, who, not left or right, but citizens of this country, to be even more engaged. I mean, we saw in the midterms, what excited me was the level of engagement, the turnout, the passion, the strategy, what we saw in wins, which don't get enough coverage, it seems to me, in the mainstream press. But we took back the House, but we also governorships, state houses after years of losing. We took there were all kinds of seats that people don't even think about, and young people were vying for them. And Run for Something had 682 candidates and won 300 seats. So there's an engagement, but when you come out of an election, you know this, Tom, you can't demobilize. Because voting is the first step on the road to participation. We have recounts going on in some key races, Stacey Abrams in Florida with Andrew Gillum and Nelson, and I think people need to stay focused on that because, again, our system is in such need of radical reform.
Yeah.
I mean, that voting in this country is still the scandal it is. I mean, the actual infrastructure of voting. Yeah. You've studied this.
I don't think this is an accident.
I don't think it's an accident. I think, in fact, I would say after 2000 and the coup that took place, yes. Bush against Gore, that we didn't have an investment in our voting infrastructure, which sounds so unsexy, was a very strategic decision on the part of those who don't want to see more people vote. Yeah. And the voter suppression is targeted, it's well funded. So I have to say, I wake up in the morning with despair and I wake up with fighting spirit. And I wake up with a sense that this country is engaged in ways it hasn't been in a long time. And that the ideas that you've been talking about on your show or we've been writing about in the nation are suddenly no longer considered fringe or marginal, but are at the center of the debate. So I think that there's, you think of Medicare for all, free higher public ed, 15 minimum wage, jobs guarantee. These are ideas now in play and important.
And these are things that when Bernie
Sanders,
let's give Bernie credit for this. He brought all of these things to national prominence, and he was explicitly, repeatedly, particularly on national television media. Yeah,
I was talking to someone this morning. We were talking about climate crisis, which is also at the center of the debate in important ways. One of the first presidential debates, CBS's John Dickerson asked the candidates, Bernie, Hillary, I think O'Malley was still in, what's the major national security crisis? Bernie said climate crisis, global warming. John Dickerson laughed. Wow. I mean, and I think that that may happen, but we're in a different. I think Bernie Sanders moved the dial, but not just Bernie Sanders, the millions of people who supported him and those who had built these ideas from the bottom up. And Bernie had them in his DNA, and what he did was speak to thousands of people at rallies around this country and in the media and refuse to be delegitimized. Yeah. And it led people around this country, think of, not so much you or me, but people who came to rallies in towns where maybe they were considered a little marginal, and they heard a presidential candidate speak the way he did. It was a lifeline. It was a sense, I'm not crazy. These are mainstream ideas in many ways. But I think that it's going to take a bold, inclusive, multiracial solidarity populism to begin to blunt, and tackle the ethno-reactionary right-wing populism, which Trump is mastering and driving and hijacking the Republican Party with. It's much more complicated than a traditional Republican president.
I think it absolutely is. But by the way, to our listeners, I see we have calls right now on the board from Illinois, Ohio, North Carolina, California, and New Mexico. Katrina's with us for the half hour, so I'll be picking up your calls at the bottom of the hour. You're welcome to hang on if you want. But just FYI because typically on Friday I
get calls. You get calls.
We call it Anything Goes Friday. I don't typically have guests, and so people are.
I like that participatory radio
spirit.
Yeah, that's good.
I love it, and it's my favorite part of the show actually is talking to the people who are interacting and listening to the program. My show yesterday, I opened it with the question, is Trump our first Confederate president? And I didn't mean that glibly. The values of the Confederacy, white supremacy, patriarchy,
racist nationalism,
white nationalism, a system of labor that at that time, it was brutal enslavement.
Indentured, but indentured kind of.
But that survives in our prison system, which is increasingly becoming a profit center and privatized. And in many ways, it survives not in a way that you would call slavery, but in a way that you could call wage slavery or something.
Absolutely.
I don't want to minimize slavery, because it's like Holocaust, But in the minute until we hit the break here, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I come back again. I think what we're witnessing, you picking up on the Confederate presidency, is a revival of a harder-edged, white supremacist Southern strategy. Yeah. and for your listeners, Southern strategy was driving the wedge issues to really drive race and racism into politics. Nixon, Buchanan, Kevin Phillips. And I think to counter that Southern strategy demands, again, a kind of multiracial building of a coalition that speaks to very different values. But there's no question that Trump, and it's not just Trump, Tom, you know this, it's the forces of Trumpism that are part of this resurgence of a 21st century Confederacy. Though I wouldn't simply root it in that experience, because what's striking is as you look around globally, there's a resurgence of this ethno-reactionary populism. The Confederate experience very seared into the American experience, but there is a global phenomenon that we're witnessing, so one has to look deeply.
I think, Orban, Erdogan, Duterte.
We need to look at the sources. We need to look at the roots. How do we address it? How do we address it? There's a reason that there's an ascendancy of strong men in these times.
Yeah, and I want to continue that conversation. I think it's a really important one. Katrina vanden Heuvel is with us.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And we're broadcasting live from the offices of The Nation magazine. We'll be back in just a minute. We're back. I'm not sure if they're coming in the studio today, but we're back with Katrina vanden Heuvel.
This ascendancy, or to be glib about it, this springtime for strong men. I think it's imperative that we look at the roots. And the roots are racialized. There is a kind of Volk, to use, a land sovereignty, nationalism of the worst kind. But there's also a sense of people being displaced, being left behind, of an economy that has worked for the elite, not for them. And I think it's important to try to speak to some of those people to try and take back the noise from a Donald Trump or those like a Duterte or Orban. It's very complicated, but one thing we're trying to do at The Nation, and I know Bernie Sanders at the end of this month is convening a kind of gathering to begin to build a left international. You got to counter something with something. There is the right-wing international, and I think to find a way to gather the forces around the world which see a different way forward, and to put on offer an alternative, and not just a no, but what is our yes, is a beginning. And he's having people from Podemos, the Spanish left party, Yanis Varoufakis, part of Syriza in Greece, Labour Party. I was just meeting with someone who's going to be part of the new Lopez Obrador government in Mexico, which is exciting. And I think Jeremy Corbyn can't go to the Bernie meeting because he's going to Obrador's inaugural gathering. So I'm just saying, I think we need, and The Nation is committed through its journalism and maybe events, to thinking hard about how you rebuild a global progressive left that has at its root very different principles that could counter the ascendancy.
Internationally and historically, there have been two groups that have been characterized as the left. There was the old communists, right? The Soviet Union and China, et cetera. Vietnam still is. And then there was the democratic socialism of Northern Europe. And
there was the non-aligned movement, to be fair. The countries who were not caught in the thrall of the Soviet Union or China, and weren't certainly caught in the thrall of unfettered predatory capitalism of the United States. But you're right, the Nordic countries, the social democratic forces in Europe, but I would argue also in Asia and Africa, the non-aligned movement was an important one.
I agree. But where I was going with that is that in retrospect, it appears that the, quote, communist movement really wasn't a movement of the left. It was really an authoritarian movement under the guise of the left. Yes, we'll give you a job, we'll give you a home, we'll give you education, we'll give you all that free stuff that supposedly comes from the left, and then we will rule with an iron fist and destroy the press. That's not the left.
No, and I think to confuse it with the left has become a right-wing project today.
It's a major
And I think a new generation, which we've seen the polls, you've seen them, Tom, a new generation which grew up in the wreckage, the ruinous wreckage of the financial crisis, has identified itself more as democratic socialist, as did Bernie Sanders. I think there's a power to that, a real lived experience, but I think it requires a lot of public education to speak to other generations which sadly often do associate socialism with the Soviet Union, or, as Fox tells us every night, Venezuela, or to be, we had a wonderful story by Kate Aronoff about the Council of Economic Advisors. Did you see this about 2 weeks ago? Where they were so frightened by socialism that they did a 60-page report, essentially an analysis of how Venezuela has failed, and that is socialism. I mean, so there's a lot of work to be done.
Yeah.
But democratic socialism among younger people is a force to be reckoned with.
Let's continue this conversation. Katrina vanden Heuvel is with us. We're at the offices of The Nation magazine in New York City. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're broadcasting live from the offices of The Nation magazine. Katrina vanden Heuvel, the publisher of The Nation, is here with us, a magazine that started in 1865 and is still ticking. Let
me step back for a moment, though, because we've been talking about left-wing internationalism. But I want to bring it home to the insurgency we're seeing in this country. And it comes off of, Democratic Socialists for America and the growth they've seen. But I think, a lot of the media after this midterm, progressives, they didn't do that well, and let's write them off. I think that's wrong. I think we're seeing the beginnings of a powerful insurgency, of new candidates, new voices, new independent electoral power structures, small donors who are sick of the big donors rigging the rules of the game. And, there are these, it's not just DSA. I mean, you have the kind of older groups, Working Families Party, People's Action, you have Indivisible, you have Democracy for America. You have extraordinary groups on the ground, like Georgia Organizing Project, Lancaster Stands Up. I mean, I think the building out of this not sexy term infrastructure will redefine our politics in important ways. I'm excited by the left, diverse, passionate women who are going to be more than 100 women, and a younger generation. Your listeners know about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also Ayanna Pressley, Deb Haaland, Jahana Hayes, and Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar. I mean, they will come, by the way, and bring a new dimension to the idea of war and peace, because they're interested in the world, to come back to that. I mean, AOC, as we call her here, she did her interview for the DSA endorsement at this table.
Wow.
We lent them the offices. I mean, we're independent, but she was here.
Yeah.
But she has a peace plank in her platform, and understands that endless war and this crazy defense budget rob resources needed to rebuild our own country. Rashida Tlaib, Palestinian, Ilhan Omar, Somali, two Muslim women. They are engaged in the world, as is Ro Khanna, who you have on your program.
Yeah, he's every other week.
His grandfather marched with Gandhi, was in prison with Gandhi. I think he comes out...
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he comes... I mean, what interests me about Ro is that I really think there's an anti-colonial history there that informs his interest in restraint and anti-intervention and building an alternative kind of
I'm going to have
engagement with
he
the
comes
world.
on every other week and takes calls for
his
a full
grandfather.
hour.
Yeah.
And that's, I had no idea.
So he's an interesting. So I take some heart in this, the beginnings of an insurgency, and I resist very mightily post-mortems that it's not happening. And then there are my colleague John Nichols, whom you know.
And is going to be on the show today.
I mean, I love the fact that we took back the governorships, more than the governorships, but certainly of the states which arguably gave Trump the election: Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania.
And yet we're seeing the way that Erdogan and the way that Orban and David Leonhardt did a great piece on this the other day in the New York Times, seized power was first they stacked the courts.
Yeah.
So that when they began behaving in ways that were unconstitutional, the courts just turned the other cheek. And Mitch McConnell's aggressively doing that. I see Brett Kavanaugh as part of that. And it concerns me tremendously that the courts, the last resort that we've historically turned to, particularly with judicial review and judicial supremacy, are
increasingly in the hands of a theocratic right. No, I think you're right. The Senate, which we haven't talked about, is also an anti-democratic institution the way it's constituted. I think that the progressive left needs to do some radical thinking and putting on offer radical thoughts, and I mean going to the root. Behind you on the wall is from 1937. The nation was divided, but half the nation supported Franklin Roosevelt's court reform program, as I call it. Another half opposed his court packing. I think the left needs to do some tough thinking about putting out there new ideas for reform of the courts, maybe term limits.
I have a book coming out on that next fall.
And the Senate needs to be thought, I mean, how it was originally constituted is anti-democratic. But I think there are a set of rules that govern our system. Simple ones like ensuring easy access to voting, the right to vote. What we saw in Florida, Amendment 4 was exciting.
Yeah.
The Florida Voting Restoration Act,
Right.
giving 1.4 Floridians the right to vote. But as John and I have talked about, Nichols, people incarcerated should have the right to vote. There should be a set of democracy reforms that are not my eyes glaze over, but are linked to movements in motion, which care and understand what these mean for their constituents, for people, for their issues. But the courts are, I mean, with Ruth Bader Ginsburg yesterday, breaking her ribs, I mean, you just...
It's frightening.
And the Kavanaugh, that went down so in such raw, you're so right, Mitch McConnell, it's raw, brutal power to achieve objectives. And we saw that with the Merrick Garland way that was handled.
Yeah.
So we need to do some tough thinking and
We do.
some radical reform.
We have just a little more than a minute left.
Okay.
What's in The Nation right now, The Nation magazine?
Well, you know, we went to press just the day of the election, so we have three very smart analyses about the midterms. But the cover story is by the woman who won the Nobel Peace Prize a year ago, Beatrice Finn, who's chair of the International Committee to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And there's her remarkable remarks, part of the Jonathan Schell lecture series, and as well a conversation she did with Eric Schlosser, who's written a terrific book on command and control and nuclear weapons. It reminds us of the peril of nuclear weapons, but it also reminds us of the possibility that we find a way to bring together the energy of the climate movement with a new nuclear movement, because the peril is very great, Tom, and I think it is, as she writes, it's a feminist issue too. So it's about a feminist foreign policy and nuclear weapons. So that's the cover. Unusual at this time, but we closed the morning post-midterm.
That's remarkable. I mean,
but she's a force, and I care deeply about reviving an anti-nuke movement, and I do think combining it with the energy of climate crisis movement, the climate movement, which Bill McKibben and others have built up, would be a way to go.
Yeah. There's in fact, we've got a new movie that we're debuting in Norway. The Norwegian Parliament. There's a conference January 5th in Oslo, and I'll be there. And they're broadcasting our movie. HBO funded it, and Leo's producing it. And on the inside of the dome, that's where we're going to see the movie. But,
that's exciting.
There's stuff happening.
There's stuff happening.
Katrina,
thank you very
so much.
Thank you. I'm so happy you're here.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be back with your calls right after this break. Stick around. Katrina Vanden Heuvel, thank you so much. And thanks to The Nation magazine for letting us use their studio. Today we're reading in Thom Hartmann University Book Club from How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, Time-Tested Methods for Conquering Worry by Dale Carnegie, perhaps an appropriate book in the era of Trump. This is from Chapter 2, a magic formula for solving worry situations. Would you like a quick, surefire recipe for handling worry situations? A technique you can start using right away before you go any further in reading this book? Then let me tell you about the method worked out by Willis H. Carrier, the brilliant engineer who launched the air conditioning industry and who headed the world-famous Carrier Corporation out of Syracuse, New York. It is one of the best techniques I've ever heard of for solving worry problems, and I got it from Mr. Carrier personally when we were having lunch together one day at the Engineers Club in New York. When I was a young man, Mr. Carrier said, I worked for the Buffalo Forge Company in Buffalo, New York. I was handed the assignment of installing a gas cleaning device in the plant of the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Company at Crystal City, Missouri.
a plant costing millions of dollars. The purpose of this installation was to remove the impurities from the gas so it could be burned without injuring the engines. This method of cleaning gas was new. It had been tried only once before and under different conditions. In my work at Crystal City, Missouri, unforeseen difficulties arose. It worked after a fashion, but not well enough to meet the guarantee we had made. I was stunned by my failure. It was almost as if someone had struck me a blow on the head. My stomach, my insides began to twist and turn. For a while, I was so worried I couldn't sleep. Finally, common sense reminded me that worry wasn't getting me anywhere. So I figured out a way to handle my problem without worrying. It worked superbly. I've been using the same anti-worry technique for more than 30 years. It is simple. Anyone can use it. It consists of 3 steps. Step 1. I analyzed the situation fearlessly and honestly and figured out what was the worst that could possibly happen as a result of this failure. No one was going to jail me or shoot me, that was certain. True, there was also a chance that I could lose my job, and there was also a chance that my employers would have to remove the machinery and lose the $20,000 we had invested. Step 2. After figuring out what was the worst that could possibly happen, I reconciled myself to accepting it, if necessary. I said to myself, this failure will be a blow to my record and it might possibly mean the loss of my job. But if it does, I can always get another position. Conditions could be much worse, and as far as my employers are concerned, well, they realize that we're experimenting with a new method of cleaning gas, and if this experience costs them $20,000, they can stand it. They can charge it up to research, for it is an experiment. After discovering the worst that could possibly happen and reconciling myself to accepting it, if necessary, an extremely important thing happened. I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in days. Step 3. From that time on, I calmly devoted my time and energy to trying to improve upon the worst which I had already accepted mentally. I now tried to figure out ways and means by which I might reduce the loss of $20,000 that we faced. I made several steps and finally figured out that if we spent another $5,000 for additional equipment, our problem would be solved. We did this, and instead of the firm losing $20,000, we made $15,000. I probably would never have been able to do this if I had kept on worrying, because one of the worst features about worrying is that it destroys the mind's ability to concentrate. When we worry, our minds jump here and there and everywhere, and we lose all power of decision. However, when we force ourselves to face the worst and accept it mentally, we then eliminate all these vague imaginings and put ourselves in a position where we are able to concentrate on our problem in the here and now. This incident that I have related occurred many years ago. It worked so superbly that I've been using it ever since, and as a result, my life has been almost completely free from worry. End of quote. Now, why is Willis H. Carrier's magic formula so valuable and so practical, psychologically speaking? Because it yanks us down out of the great gray clouds in which we fumble around when we are blinded by worry. It plants our feet good and solid on the earth. We know where we stand, and if we can't have solid ground under us, how in creation can we ever hope to think anything through? Professor William James, the father of applied psychology, has been dead since 1910, but if he were alive today and could hear this formula for facing the worst, he would heartily approve. How do I know? Because he told his own students, quote, "Be willing to have it so. Be willing to have it so," he said, because acceptance of what has happened is the first step in overcoming the consequences of any misfortune, end quote. The same idea is expressed by Lin Yutang in his widely read book, The Importance of Living. True peace of mind, says this Chinese philosopher, comes from accepting the worst. Psychologically, I think it means the release of energy. That's it exactly. Psychologically, it means a new release of energy. When we have accepted the worst, we have nothing more to lose. And that automatically means we have everything to gain. After facing the worst, Willis H. Carrier reported, I immediately relaxed and felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in days. From that time on, I was able to think. Makes sense, doesn't it? Yet millions of people have wrecked their lives in angry turmoil because they refuse to accept the worst, refuse to improve upon it, refuse to salvage what they could from the wreck. Instead of trying to reconstruct their fortunes, they engaged in a bitter and violent contest of experience and ended up victims of that brooding fixation known as melancholia. Would you like to see how someone else adopted Willis H. Carrier's magic formula and applied it to his own problem? Well, here's one example from a New York oil dealer who was a student in my classes. I was being blackmailed, the student began. I didn't believe it was possible. I didn't believe it could happen outside the movies, but I was actually being blackmailed. And, you know, he goes on with his story. It's a fascinating one. How to Stop Worrying and Start Living by Dale Carnegie.
Back to the show.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, broadcasting live from the offices of The Nation magazine in New York City. I'm here in New York because last night I met Adam McKay years ago when he and I were both on Bill Maher. And he was like, oh, I've listened to your show for years. I love it. And I was like, you know, I love your movies. And I think The Big Short had just come out at that time. And, you know, we've sort of kept in touch over the years. I sent him a note about 6 months ago saying, you know, this new movie Vice you're doing just looks spectacular. And he sent me back a note saying, wow, you got to come to the it's not an opening or a premiere because the movie's not even actually done. They're still tweaking the music and stuff like that. But so I'm not sure what the official word that they use in the movie business for this is. I guess private screening. But you know, me and maybe, I don't know, 100 other people were invited to this private screening here in New York City. And, you know, I can't tell you a lot about the movie just because that wouldn't be appropriate. I mean, they don't want movie reviews until the movie's actually out. And like I said, it's not quite done. But my God, this thing just took my breath away. It is the story of Dick Cheney and the story of the man who almost single-handedly, along with some help from Antonin Scalia, dismantled or began the dismantlement of democracy in America. And when this movie, Vice, I'm telling you, get ready. It's going to come out around Christmas time. And when this movie comes out, it's going to blow your socks off. Chris Hayes was there last night. In fact, he did a Q&A with Adam afterwards. And my old friend Sam Cedar was there, and Sam and I went, they had a reception at a restaurant down the street, and Sam and I sat and talked for quite a while. And his show is growing, you know, Majority Report. He's doing it, it's available as a podcast, and it's live on YouTube. And he's just doing great too. So anyhow, that's the update on what's going on here and why I'm here and what I'm doing in New York City. And you know, the people at ProPublica were so nice to let us use their conference room yesterday, and the same thing for The Nation magazine. Joe Madison will be with us in our second hour. John Nichols will be with us. I'm not sure if it's second or third hour, but he'll be on the show briefly. But typically, it's Friday. It's Anything Goes Friday. And you know, I think Katrina and I pretty much touched on most of the top topics of the day. So let's pick up your phone calls. Dion in Round Lake, Illinois. Hey, Dion, what's on your mind today?
Tom, the Democrats they want a lot of seats with the House, and I don't think that they're going to go after subpoenas right away because I think they got leverage to get Trump to pass legislation in their favor. Would you agree with that?
I think that they can walk and chew gum at the same time. Trump knows that if the Democrats come to him with a reasonable infrastructure bill, which will keep the economy from collapsing, if they come to him with a reasonable fix to the Affordable Care Act that, quote, protects pre-existing conditions, now that the Republican Party has officially embraced that, that it would be political suicide to blow it up, ignore it, veto it, or whatever. And also, you know, while Trump can bluster and blither all he wants, he doesn't, at the end of the day, necessarily control Mitch McConnell in the Senate. And so I'm not so concerned, Dion. I don't think that the Democrats are facing an either-or choice. The committees, the appropriate committees, you know, oversight, intelligence in particular, whichever committee handles tax stuff, it's got a kind of multi-word name, they should be looking into things that have to do with Trump. I mean, we have a guy in the White House who has committed crimes apparently through his whole entire life, you know, the Trump crime family. And so, you know, I think we're going to see something happen.
Unless the donors of the Democrats get in the way and the establishment Democrats.
I'm not so concerned about that. I am really not. Dion, thanks for the call. I think it's a new day. I really do. You know, I can't overstate how important Bernie Sanders' primary was, which is not to say or even take a position on Bernie going to 2020. But what he did in that primary by taking these topics that literally were being laughed about by many elected Democrats and certainly by the news media, the global climate change, $15 minimum wage, the right of unions, Medicare for all. These core issues that Bernie campaigned on are actually where America is at. John in Jeffersonville, Ohio. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out like an overview real quickly. And it's that the only thing that the Republican people have is money. That's it. That's all they've got. But if you could set it home and you could come up with an idea where you could get 400,000 votes and from the Democrats to the Republicans, you could take that to a Republican and sell it to them and probably get a cush job for $150,000 a year. That's what they've got going for them. We've got a Trump. Yeah. We've got a card, and I don't mean to use Trump, but we've got a Trump card that beats that every time, and it's we the people. But we have to be engaged. And this election that we just had has to be just a start. We have to fight every single day from here on until the next election to win. I mean, we can do it, but it takes people power, and we have to stay engaged. And for these people who are splashing the pan, I voted for a Democrat, and they didn't give me everything I wanted, and it doesn't matter if I vote, and I'm going to vote for a third party. You guys are deceiving yourself. It's a long game. We have to all be in it together, and we have to stay working.
Yeah, amen, John. Very well said. I am watching not just the nature of our government, and John, thanks for the call, not just the nature of our government change, but the nature of the electorate is changing. America is waking up. Katrina and I were talking about, Bernie's radical ideas. Every single one of those ideas is the law in Canada, in Sweden, in Denmark, in Norway, in France, in Germany, in Finland, in Spain. Was the law in Italy and Greece. Now they've been, hit with this so-called austerity, but this it works. This is good stuff. Dana in High Point, North Carolina. Hey, Dana, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I just want to let you know, first of all, that you can put me on hold all day long if that's how long you have Katrina on, because I love to hear from her.
Yeah, she is good.
To say.
Thank you.
We are in a constitutional crisis. Okay, Whitaker, the appointment of Whitaker is on its face obstruction of justice, because we all know that the heart of obstruction is intent, and the intent is clear. There's no other reason he would have appointed this guy.
And it's also illegal.
Obstruct. And it's
the Constitution says that the senior cabinet officers have to be approved by the Senate, and Whitaker has not been approved by the Senate. He has no business in that job.
I am horrified that what is happening right now is that he is extracting the entire Mueller files from Mueller, and he's going to turn those right over to Trump, which is going to be a horrible disaster with unimaginable consequences. And what I propose, and I hope to God this is happening, is that Mueller refuses. He should refuse, and then which will force Whitaker and Trump to fire him, which will then exacerbate the whole thing. I think he should refuse and negotiate to turn him over to Rod Rosenstein and through Rod to the Congress to avoid this imminent disaster.
Yeah, I'm not. I'm a little more sanguine about this, this whole process. I think that on the one, actually, I could argue both sides of it. On the one hand, and I mentioned this yesterday, that even if they were to fire Mueller tomorrow, right, or today, and just shut the whole thing down, fire him, say, okay, you're out of here. You got Robert Mueller and 14, 15, major investigators and senior lawyers and litigators who are working with him. All of them could be subpoenaed. Yeah, right. Yeah, in fact, they're all Republican, or most of them are Republicans. Right. But they could be subpoenaed by House committees, particularly intelligence, because of the Russia aspect of this, and foreign, and whatever committee is in charge of foreign policy, and could simply be on the record, say, okay, in private session we'll talk about the secret stuff. In public session, though, what'd you learn? Is Trump a criminal? Did he collude with Russia? And Mueller could just lay it out. So, I mean, there's, at this point in time, now that the Democrats control the House of Representatives, in my opinion, there's nothing that Trump can do to stop that. That's the upside note. The downside note is really where you began, Dana, and in your call, and you're so right, that the Constitution requires that the Secretary of State the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Interior, all of these guys, and obviously the head of the Justice Department, that the Secretary of Homeland Security, that all and their number 2 people, which would be Rosenstein now, the Attorney General's office, that all of them they do not have the power to even ask somebody to get them a cup of coffee until they've been confirmed by the Senate. And you've got Whitaker walking in there saying, I'm in charge, I'm taking over. And that's a violation of the Constitution. And if there's not a major lawsuit that takes this to the Supreme Court really fast, I would be amazed. And that's when we're going to find out if our democracy is going to survive, Dana. Because if they take that to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court says, the president can do what he wants, which we know Brett Kavanaugh will say. Go ahead. Dana?
Yes, the Solicitor General would have been appointed. He's confirmed by the Senate. If Trump did not want to let Rod Rosenstein head it.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the Solicitor General, by the way, is a little creepy himself. But he's not a right-wing, Breitbart nutball like Whitaker appears to be. Dana, thanks for the call.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We are really and truly at an inflection point right now for American democracy. And, hang on to your seats. It's going to get wild. And welcome back. Dennis in Bergen, New Jersey. Hey, Dennis, you're on the air. What's on your mind today?
Tom, I have a question, quick question. So I know before, this is about Glass-Steagall. You've said that the Glass-Steagall, the prevention of it, allowed commercial banks to engage with the gambling houses on Wall Street and gamble with people's money.
Not just engage with them, they bought them.
Yeah, hustlers on Wall Street can hustle with your money in the bank, and this caused the gambling bubbles to collapse as well as the banking. Could you explain what you mean by all this? Because, I just want to follow with this.
Sure. Yeah, the way it used to work is that you had investment banks, they called themselves investment houses, Merrill Lynch, Schwab, these groups like that. Merrill Lynch was probably the biggest. That you gave them your money, and that money was not guaranteed by the FDIC. It was for investment purposes. You were told right up front you might lose your money. And, nowadays you can buy and sell stock on your own, but it used to be you always had, you still had to go through a broker. But it used to be much more constrained. But basically, there was that world, and that was a world of essentially gambling. You're betting something's going to go up or go down, and if you're not gambling, by the way, if you know that something's going to go up or down, then you've committed a crime. That's called trading on insider information. So it really was a gambling world. And then on the other hand, you had the what are called commercial banks, and commercial banks are guaranteed by the FDIC up to, I think it's $250,000 per deposit. And the commercial banks are constrained in what they could do. They could do mortgages, they could do car loans, they could do loans of all kinds. They could do savings accounts, and they can do checking accounts, and that's and wire transfers and things. But they could not gamble with your money. And Glass-Steagall was the law that was put into place in I think it was 1933. It might have been 4 or 5, FDR. But it was in the it was early on in FDR's administration. And the whole reason he did this is because literally the week that FDR was inaugurated, every bank in America failed. Up to that point, it was about 70% of them, and in that last week, the final 30% went, and there wasn't a single bank left. And so we had to rebuild the banking system, and FDR said, if we're going to rebuild the banking system, we're going to do it on new rules, to borrow a phrase from Bill Maher. And so the essence of Glass-Steagall was very, very simple. Commercial banks do the stuff of commerce, right? They facilitate commerce, checking accounts, mortgages, savings accounts, and mortgages. And investment houses facilitate investment. and they operate under a completely different set of rules. Well, with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley bill that was passed in the late 90s, I think it was 98 or 99.
Right.
In fact, I'm pretty sure it was 99. What that did is it basically dismantled Glass-Steagall and said, you know, if a bank is in... That's right. And so you had these big banks buying these big investment houses or vice versa. And you even had companies starting banks. General Electric started a bank. General Motors started a bank. You know, in GM's case, just to loan money to people to buy cars and things. And these hybrid entities are the ones that failed in the 2008 crash. This is where, you know, a lot of this was coming from, because now investors' money, which can be lost, they're you know, supposedly forewarned, was commingled with depositors' money and checkbook money. And that would have been a national disaster, and that's why they bailed out the banks. They shouldn't have had to bail out the banks. They should have just let the investment banks go down in flames, but this is what we got. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you live from New York City, and Jeff in San Francisco. Hey, Jeff, what's on your mind today?
Oh, I'm just a little sad L.A. public banking Plan B didn't go through.
Do you know anything about why that failed? I mean, were the banks running ads against it? I don't see the California ads up in
San
Oregon.
Francisco working on our own plan here, so I don't have anything in direct.
Yeah.
I'm in contact with Twitter people down there, so I'll get some more details later on. But, you know, they're pretty positive. I mean, I think it was only 4 months, and they got, I think they got like 42% of the votes they needed. I think they only needed to get over half, so they came pretty close.
Right.
I mean, 260,000 votes. So
you're trying to make this happen for San Francisco, Jeff?
Yeah, we have a task force up here. I mean, we have the what do they call it? Chamber of Commerce guys are in there watering it down like you can't believe, you know. We'll give you $500 million when there's literally, you know, there's billions there to use. You know, if you use the money that you have in, you know, property, if you use, you know, stuff from the infrastructure. But I'm thinking that hopefully maybe Gavin can get a state bank, and we can use Gavin Newsom, our new governor, and we could use that money that's in the state bank to start a single payer. And he could take that into the presidency and say, hey, it's working here. Why can't it work all over America?
Yeah.
So that's my dream.
I think that we can fund single payer successfully if we simply reintroduced what used to be referred to as the STET tax. STET stands for Security Transaction Excise Tax. And what it was basically a 1/4 cent tax on every time a share of stock was bought or sold. And we started that in the 1930s. FDR put it in place to pay for the budget of the Securities and Exchange Commission, which he created out of thin air to regulate the investment banks, to pick up on a conversation we were just having about commercial versus investment banks. And in 1963 or 64, the investment banks came along, you know, with a lot of money and a lot of lobbyists, and said, you know, the STET tax the SEC is running on a budget. Now I'm not sure I ever even knew the numbers, but I know broadly the kind of nature of the numbers. The SEC is running on, say, a budget of $300 or $400 million a year, but the STET tax is producing $4 or $5 billion a year. So, you know, it was put into place to pay for the SEC. Jeff, thanks for the call. And we no longer need it. And so Congress blew it away. And that STET tax, if that were passed right now, you know, I think Bernie calls it the Robin Hood tax. There's other names for it. But basically, if we just went back to doing what we did from 1933 or 34 until 1963 or 64, you know, it worked for 30 years. The banking industry wasn't hobbled by it. Investments weren't hurt. The stock market grew like crazy. And just taxing the investment industry, which is, by the way, half of Americans don't even own stock, And of the Americans who do own stock, 80% of them own less than $10,000 worth of stock. So, you know, the majority of stock is held by the top 10%. And the big majority of it is held by the top 1%. So, you know, it's a way of taxing the rich, I suppose, but it's a tax on when they're making, you know, how they're making their money. And it's more than enough to pay for single-payer health care, which is a big deal. Wayne in Chicago. Hey, Wayne, what's on your mind?
Hey, how you doing, Tom, this morning? I have two questions. And I want to comment after the second question, rather. The first question is, Tom, what is your theory on why the Democratic nominee for governor in Florida conceded so quickly? Al Gore found out that the Supreme Court said that if we count these ballots, then George W. Bush, it will hurt him, so we're not going to count the ballots. Al Gore just went away quietly, and come to find out it was George Bush won by less than 600 votes, and he really didn't win at all because they didn't count the votes. So why would the Democratic nominee for governor in Florida concede so easily when he already knew he was set up before the election started?
I suspect, Wayne, that he didn't want to be seen as a sore loser. There's when you get that, there are labels that they attach to you that follow you. You know, the whole ridiculing Al Gore for saying he invented the internet. He never said that. What he said was he wrote the legislation that created the internet, which was absolutely true. He wrote the DARPA legislation that created the internet, or co-authored it. But you know, they ridiculed him for it, and I think that. And this is how they went after Don Siegelman in Alabama when he said, hey, wait a minute, you found 15,000 votes in the middle of the night and all those people voted for every Democrat on the ticket except me? Really? I'm not believing that. And, you know, right-wing radio across the state went after him, and ultimately he was prosecuted and thrown into prison on trumped-up charges. So I think that Andrew Gillum was trying to, and all the networks had called the election, you know, for Rick DeSantis. So I think that probably it was that he wanted to live to fight another day. He wanted to keep his political reputation intact. He damn near won the thing, which is astonishing, not just for a Democrat, but for a black Democrat in the South at a statewide level, you know, in a state as racist as Florida, particularly up in the northern part of Florida. That's damn amazing. So I think he was just trying to keep himself intact.
I think he could have kept himself more intact by fighting, because he, like I said, he knew he was set up before. I'm
inclined to agree with you, Wayne, but you know, history will tell if you know
anyway,
which is right. We got 30 seconds. You had another thing you wanted to say.
What do you think about this thing about Nancy Pelosi coming back to be Speaker of the House? What are your thoughts on that?
I love Nancy Pelosi. I think she's one of the most effective leaders we've ever had. She knows where the bodies are buried. She knows who needs what and how to get it to them. She knows how to wield power. She got, if you look at the first 2 years of the Obama administration, when they had 72 days of absolute power and 2 years of some power, she got more done than I think any speaker has in a long, long time. And, you know, she herself has said that she now views herself as a transitional figure. She looks forward to handing the baton off to the next generation. I'm just not sure who that person would be. I think there's some great candidates, but I support Nancy Pelosi. Wayne, thanks a lot for the call. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Hey, thanks so much for your support for the Thom Hartmann Program, along with your support for Free Speech TV. We deliver our program, of course, to commercial stations, which is how we pay our bills through the revenue from running advertising, and you can learn more about those at our website at thomhartmann.com. But we also share our program with non-commercial outlets, from Free Speech TV to Pacifica stations all over the country. And because with the Pacifica radio stations, there's basically no revenue coming in, the way that we support our nonprofit outreach is in large part through Patreon. And, you know, over at Patreon, people who support our program at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann, people who support our program there get, you know, special little clips, and there's a few other goodies, behind the scenes kind of stuff. But that's principally, if you want to support the Thom Hartmann Program, that's the way to do it, is to get over to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann and check out what we're doing and support our program. Thank you. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study by Stefano Harney and Fred Moten. This is from the introduction. It starts with love, exchange, fellowship. It ends as it begins, in motion, in between various modes of being and belonging, and on the way to new economies of giving, taking, being with and for. And it ends with a ride in a Buick Skylark on a way to another place altogether. Surprising, perhaps, after we have engaged dispossession, debt, dislocation, and violence, but not surprising when you have understood that the projects of fugitive planning and black study are mostly about reaching out to find connection. They are about making common cause with the brokenness of being, a brokenness, I would venture to say, that is also blackness, that remains blackness, and will, despite all, remain broken, because this book is not a prescription for repair. If we do not seek to fix what has been broken, then what? How do we resolve to live with brokenness, with being broke, which is also what Moten and Harney called debt? Well, given that debt is sometimes a history of giving, at other times a history of taking, at all times a history of capitalism, and given that debt also signifies a promise of ownership but never delivers on that promise, we have to understand that debt is something that cannot be paid off. Debt, as Harney puts it, presumes a kind of individualized realization to a naturalized economy that is predicated upon exploitation. Can we have, he asks, another sense of what is owed that does not presume a nexus of activities like recognition and acknowledgement, payment and gratitude? Can debt become a principle of elaboration? Moten thinks Moten links economic debt to the brokenness of being in the interview with Stefan Shukatis, who he acknowledges that some debts should be paid and that much is owed, especially to black people, by white people. And yet he says, I also know that it is, that what it is that is supposed to be repaired is irreparable. It can't be repaired. The only thing we can do is tear this stuff down completely and build something new, end of quote. The Undercommons do not come to pay their debts, to repair what has been broken, to fix what has been undone. If you want to know what the Undercommons wants, what Moten and Harney want, what black people, indigenous people, queers, and poor people want, what we, the we who cohabit in the space of the Undercommons, want, it is this. We cannot be satisfied with the recognition and acknowledgement generated by the very system that denies A, that anything was ever broken, and B, that we deserve to be the broken part. So we refuse to ask for recognition, and instead we want to take apart, dismantle, tear down that structure right now. That right now limits our ability to find each other, to see beyond it, and to access the places that we know live outside its walls. We cannot say what new structures will replace the ones we live with yet, because once we have torn stuff down, we will inevitably see more and see differently and feel a new sense of wanting and being and becoming. What we want after the break will be different from what we think we want before the break, and both are necessarily different from the desires that issue from being in the dark. Let's come at this by another path. In the melancholic and visionary 2009 film version of Maurice Sendak's Where the Wild Things Are, 1963, Max, the small seeker who leaves his room, his home, his family to find the world beyond, finds a world of lost and lonely beasts, and they promptly make him their king. Max is the first king the wild things have had, whom they did not eat, and who did not, in turn, try to eat them. And the beasts are the first grown things that Max has met who want his opinion, his judgment, and his rule. Max's power is that he is small while they are big. He promises the beasts that he has no plans to eat them, and that this is more than anyone has ever promised them. He promises them that he will find ways through and around and will slip through the cracks and re-crack the cracks if they fill up. He promises to keep sadness at bay and to make the world with the wild creatures that roared their terrible roars and gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes and showed their terrible claws. That Max fails to make the wild things happy or to save them or to make the world with them is less important than the fact that he found them and he recognized in them the end of something and potentially the path to an alternative in his world, or an alternative to his world, excuse me. The wild things were not the utopian creatures of fairy tales. They were the rejected and lost subjects of the world Max had left behind. And because he shuttles between the Oedipal land where his mother rules and the ruined world of the wild, he knows the parameters of the real. He sees what is included and what is left out. And he is now able to set sail for another place, a place that is neither the home he left nor the home to which he wants to return. Moten and Harney want to gesture to another place, a wild place that is not simply the leftover space that limbs real and regulated zones of polite society. Rather, it is a wild place that continuously produces its own unregulated wilderness. The zone we enter through Moten and Harney is ongoing and exists in the present, and as Harney puts it, some kind of demand is already being enacted, fulfilled in the call itself. While describing the riots of London in 2011, Harney suggests that the riots and insurrections do not separate out the request, the demand, and the call. Rather, they enact the one in the other. The book is The Undercommons, Fugitive Planning and Black Study.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us is our old friend Joe Madison, friend of the show. He is the host of the Joe Madison Show, weekdays 6 to 10 a.m. on Sirius XM Channel 126. He's a civil and human rights activist. JoeMadison.com, spelled just the way it sounds, is his website, and you can tweet him at Madison SiriusXM. Joe, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you, Tom. Thank you.
It's great having you with us. So I'm in New York right now doing the show live from the studios at The Nation magazine. And therefore there's about a second latency, by the way, between us. So you know, if we talk over each other or whatever, that's why. My apologies. There's nothing I can do about it. But here in New York last night, Times Square was so clogged that it basically shut down traffic in the center of town with these protests in support of Robert Mueller. I understand you were in the midst of something very similar in Washington, D.C. Can you tell us about it?
Absolutely. The group was at MoveOn.org, and along with probably scores of other organizations that pulled this off, Lafayette Square, which is directly across the street from the White House, was packed. I mean, absolutely packed from corner to corner. You know, you should know this, Tom, that they don't allow demonstrations now in front of the White House. It used to be there on Pennsylvania Avenue. Now they've moved them over to Lafayette Square. But that did not diminish the enthusiasm. And then I was on the phone texting Elijah Cummings, and he then said in the city of Baltimore, there was almost 1,000 people that showed up there. And we should also point out, Tom, that I was in Lafayette Square in downtown Washington, D.C., but the suburbs of Washington, D.C., Silver Spring and other suburbs, they had huge crowds. So the young people really used the social media, and think about this, pulled it together in less than 12 hours.
in less than 12 hours, I interviewed the young man who is the Washington director for MoveOn.org, and he was giving me all the information about how quickly this all came together.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. Joe, in our last conversation, I think it was last week or the week before, we were talking about a movement, not a moment. It seems to me like the movement is here and it's going to stick around for a while. Is that your sense?
Well, I think yes, but remember what I said. What qualifies a movement, and that is sacrifice. And young people and others have got to understand that this is going to require sacrifice. Now, people say, "Well, what are you going to sacrifice?" That's up to the individual. It may be their time, it might be their money, it might be their energy. Who knows? And as this movement keeps growing, we're all going to be asked to sacrifice an awful lot. And now what we have to do, all of us, is not allow us to be divided by race and age and I would even say partisanship, because you now have Flake and what is the other senator, his friend, is it Combs, who have introduced bills to protect Mueller, and that bill should come up in the Senate on Tuesday, because they've already filed the bill. And this, as somebody said last night, Tom, this is not a partisan issue. This isn't about partisanship. This is about what is right. And that is to let Mueller finish, and we're right there at the finish line, and let's find out what he has and go forward.
Yeah. Yeah. What are you hearing on your show as the major issues that people want the Democratic Party to hit the ground running with in January when they're sworn in?
Easily. That's easy. That's easy. Number one, health care. Right there at the top. No ifs, ands, buts about it. Infrastructure. And then number three on my show would be to correct what the Supreme Court did to the Voting Rights Act, the so-called pre-clearance part, I believe. That's what's at the top. Healthcare, infrastructure, because that means jobs. That means improving our communities, roads and rails and airports, and then of course right at the top is the issue of the Voting Rights Act. And when you see what's going on in Florida right now and in Georgia and all these other voter suppression efforts that were put in place, one automatically after the Supreme Court ruled years ago, and then what certainly happened right after President Obama got elected. These suppressive measures went into effect almost immediately, and so I think those are the top issues.
John Roberts weirdly wrote that this is a very different America than it was in 1965, and racism is a thing of the past, and therefore we no longer need this legislation that passed the Senate with 99-0, as I recall, unanimous vote or damn near. Or maybe it was 98-2. You probably know. Correct me.
I don't know the exact
if I'm wrong
figure. Yeah, but go ahead. Yeah.
It was nearly unanimous. Everything I'm seeing tells me that we haven't changed much at all. I mean, we might have elected a black president, and a lot of people thought, okay, that's it. We've won, and they kind of went back to sleep, and that brought us 2010. But, Trump was still out there with his birtherism stuff, and I'm sure you know what Michelle Obama wrote about that in her book, that what danger he put her and her family in. And in the final 2 minutes here, I'm curious your thoughts on the state of all that right now.
Well, look, let me just make it very simple, as my grandfather used to tell me, Tom. Joseph, just put it where the goats can get it, in plain language, in other words. Take it to the root. And that is, look, Jim Crow still exists. We don't count how many bubbles are in a bar of soap or how many jelly beans are in a jar or poll taxes. What we have now is the sophisticated cousin of Jim Crow, James Crow Esquire Jr. And that's all these suppression laws are. They're just James Crow dressed up in a pinstripe suit. It has to have the same exact effect, and that is to suppress the vote, to make it difficult. That's what our grandfathers had to go through, and that's what these young people are going through now. And so Roberts was absolutely wrong. And matter of fact, those in the Republican Party know that they introduced laws to suppress that vote. As I said, most of these voter suppression laws didn't even have a problem. They didn't start until after they saw this huge turnout related to President Obama's campaign and eventual election. So just tell your audience it's very simple. It's not Jim Crow, but it is certainly James Crow Esquire Jr., and the impact is still the same.
Yeah, and all the same amount of effort and thought and legal and everything else going into it. Joe Madison, you can hear his show 6 to 10 a.m. Eastern on SiriusXM channel 126. JoeMadison.com is the website, Madison SiriusXM, the Twitter handle. Thank you, Joe.
All right, and have a great weekend.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Thank you, Joe. You too. And look forward to, hopefully I'd see you next week. I'm going to be in town. We'll be right back. And welcome back. Let's see here. Joe in Cupertino, California. Hey, Joe, what's on your mind today? Thanks for watching us on Free Speech TV.
Good Friday morning, Tom. Love your show. I'm over here. I'm watching the fire in Malibu. It's just killing me. And the smoke, I'm about 150 miles away from Northern California, and the smoke is so bad up here in the Bay Area that the kids are being told to stay indoors. So global warming's for real.
Really?
I think that's great.
Wow.
The reason I get to call today is to tell you how grateful I am for the results of the election. I kind of lived this, as you can tell, but being as close to the election as I am, we won by over 73% of the votes, and we still have just closed. We haven't even really closed yet because it's like 3 days after the election before all the other ballots come in. But I'm looking at numbers here on the West Coast that are just so impressive. I want to just continue to support the youth vote. I think that that's how we made the difference this time. It's a big deal. What is it, 94? We took the House back, and so here we are now in 2018. But 2020 is around the corner, and I really wanted to suggest, if you could, because you have more pull than I do, we need to get Bernie, and we need to get Bernie fast, because he's the guy. I mean, if he can't do it, he's the guy on his face. So many people are watching. He can just say, hey, I'm running, and I'll guarantee you'll see people in the streets, just like you did yesterday, supporting his candidacy. And I know that you've spoken to him. I saw him on the phone the other day. Maybe he doesn't want to. I don't know. But if he doesn't, maybe we can have him give us an idea of who he might support. Secondly, you talked about Speaker. I really love her, too. But I think it's time for a new face, and that new face could be Barbara Lee. I think Barbara Lee has demonstrated that she's got the desire, that she's got the support, and she's a woman of color. And at this point, I think that would really make Trump upset, because I think he wants us to let Nancy and him square off, but he's not ready to deal with Barbara Lee. What do you think?
Yeah. Barbara Lee is great, and I think she'd make a great Speaker of the House. There are no doubt other members of the House as well, and I'm not one of these guys who does politics the way people do sports. I can't recite the names and congressional districts of all the people and what they, what everybody has done. So I really, off the top of my head, don't have, a person who I would say, this person is the one who should follow Nancy Pelosi. But I guarantee you that she's figuring that out. But the main thing that pretty much nobody talks about, but really is the job of Speaker of the House, is wielding power. And wielding power in a fairly ruthless fashion. And Nancy Pelosi can do that. She does it with a smile, she does it with grace, but if she takes you down, you're going down. And if she's building you up, you're going up. And if there's a piece of legislation that she wants, she knows how to make it happen. And if there's a piece of legislation that she thinks is wrong for the country and she wants it killed, she will get it killed. And so, it shouldn't be a popularity contest. It shouldn't be, who's on TV most often and we all like the way he or she looks, or, who has the perfect punch list of progressive issues. I want somebody in the Speaker of the House's position to be a person who absolutely knows how to take names and kick ass. And that is Nancy Pelosi right now. And, I will trust her in terms of who she nominates to follow her, because it's really about power. Joe, thanks a lot for the call. I do appreciate it. We'll be back with more of your calls on Anything Goes Friday right after this. Hey, thanks so much for your support for the Thom Hartmann Program, along with your support for Free Speech TV. We deliver our program, of course, to commercial stations, which is how we pay our bills through the revenue from running advertising, and you can learn more about those at our website at thomhartmann.com. But we also share our program with non-commercial outlets, from Free Speech TV to Pacifica stations all over the country. And because with the Pacifica radio stations, there's basically no revenue coming in, the way that we support our nonprofit outreach is in large part through Patreon. And, over at Patreon, people who support our program at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. People who support our program there get, special little clips, and there's a few other goodies, behind the scenes kind of stuff. But that's principally, if you want to support the Thom Hartmann Program, that's the way to do it, is to get over to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann and check out what we're doing and support our program. Thank you.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Broadcasting live from the offices of The Nation in New York City, John in Chicago. Hey, John, what's on your mind today?
Hi there. Well, since I believe our country is pretty much a plutocracy and we're governed by the extremely elite wealthy, I'm just wondering if and how we can ever have a Congress, a Senate, or a president who does not allow their popularity to trump their own integrity. I feel like in this country, we don't look at integrity in our candidates or their morals, and we are just chasing our own tail with wealthy people running us, and they know they can run us by letting us only have two choices of the election, Republicans or Democrats. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then I can maybe make one more comment.
The simple reality is, John, that when the framers of the Constitution put it together, there had never been in the history of the world at that point in time a parliamentary system, a parliamentary democracy. In a parliamentary democracy, if a party gets 10% of the vote, they get 10% of the seats. If they get 16% of the vote, they get 16% of the seats. It makes it easy to have multiple political parties. But they didn't, John Stuart Mill proposed that in 1861 in his book on liberty. So, that literally did not exist in 1787 when they were writing the Constitution. So instead, they wanted to have a democracy, and they didn't want to do it exactly the way the Greeks did, which is where the elected officials were selected by lottery. It was like jury duty. That's how the Greeks did it. They wanted to do it by popular support. And so what they put together was what we call a first-past-the-post, winner-take-all system, where if you get more than 50% of the vote, you're the person. Or if you get a plurality of the vote, if there are three candidates, whoever gets the most votes. Although some states require a runoff to get to that 50%. They're so wedded to that system of first-past-the-post. And Madison, after the Constitution was written in 1787, in 1788, in Federalist number, or in 1789, excuse me, in Federalist number 10, Madison realized, you know, this, if political parties emerge, this is going to cause us to have two political parties, and functionally only two, because any other political party is going to basically be something that either supports or hurts one of the two major political parties because of this 50% thing. And, you know, and his concern was, you know, if there were three political parties, you could have somebody, you know, elected to the Senate or House with 33% of the vote. Even though they are not wanted by the majority of the people, they would be the senator. If there were four parties, it would be 26% of the vote. If it were five parties, it would be 21% of the vote. Still, the majority of the people, you know, 79% of the people don't want this person to be the senator, but they're the senator because there's five political parties. And Madison was like, I don't know what to do about this. And so I encourage you to go back and read Federalist number 10. He basically said, please don't start political parties. You know, faction is what he referred to it as. You know, the corrupting power of faction. Please don't do it. And, you know, within 5 years, the Federalists had formed. George Washington was, you know, embraced the Federalists about a year into his first term in office. And the Federalists, they were the idea, and Dan Sisson and I write about this in the book, The American Revolution of 1800. There's a whole chapter about this. The founders actually believed that the best way to run the country was with a single party, and that the Federalists should be that single party. And they believed that right up until around 1793. And in 1793, Thomas Jefferson, who was Secretary of State in George Washington's administration, said, I don't like the direction the Federalists are going. This John Adams guy, who was the vice president, this John Adams guy is starting to behave like an autocrat, and the Federalists are starting to behave like they think they're the heirs of kings. And he started a movement called the Anti-Federalists, and about 5 years later, it was renamed the Democratic Republican Party, because the Federalists were then referring themselves as the Federalist Party. And Jefferson, and then in the 1830s, they dropped the word Republican from the name. And so Jefferson started the Democratic Party, you know, while he was still in the administration of George Washington. And ever since then, we've had a two-party system because of that first past the post winner take all situation. And so, you know, when the Federalists faded out, they were replaced by the Whigs in the 1820s. When the Whigs faded out in the 1850s, they were replaced by the modern day Republican Party. And we've had attempts at third parties. You know, numerous ones. The Libertarians, the Greens are the ones everybody knows about. There was the Reform Party, there was the American Party, there was the Know Nothing movement, which had a name, I forget what it was, the Star Spangled Banner Party. But none of them have ever done anything other than harm or damage one of the major parties. So what we're left with, John, since we don't have a parliamentary system, is the absolute imperative, if we want to have a functioning democracy that operates on progressive values, so that our government can do the things for our people, from health care to a rational defense policy, like the countries of Europe and Canada do, we have to get inside the Democratic Party and take it over. We need and John, thanks for the call. We need an absolute progressive takeover of the Democratic Party, much like the Tea Partiers, the Koch brothers, and the billionaire crazies took over the Republican Party, you know, starting in the 1980s, but really cemented their control with the administration of George W. Bush. We'll be back right after this.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
In fact, coming up next, John Nichols, who writes for The Nation, is going to drop by. We're going to have a conversation about what's going on, the horsemen of the Trumpocalypse.
Today in the Thom Hartmann University Book Club, we're reading from Johann Hari's brand new book, Lost Connections, Uncovering the Real Causes of Depression and the Unexpected Solutions. So he starts out talking about how he had been on antidepressants for most of his life, from his teenage years into his 30s. And then he says, then when I was 31 years old, I found myself chemically naked for the first time in my adult life. For almost a decade, I had been ignoring my therapist's gentle reminders that I was still depressed despite my drugs. It was only after a crisis in my life, when I felt unequivocally terrible and couldn't shake it off, that I decided to listen to him. What I had been trying for so long wasn't, it seemed, working. And so when I flushed away my final packs of Paxil, I found these mysteries waiting for me, like children on a train platform waiting to be collected, trying to catch my eye. Why was I still depressed? Why were there so many people like me? And I realized there was a third mystery hanging over all of it. Could something other than bad brain chemistry have been causing depression and anxiety in me and in so many people all around me? If so, what could it be? Still, I put off looking into it. Once you settle into a story about your pain, you're extremely reluctant to challenge it. It was like a leash I had put on my distress to keep it under control. I feared that if I messed with the story I'd lived with for so long, the pain would be like an unchained animal and would savage me. Over a period of several years, I fell into a pattern. I would begin to research these mysteries by reading scientific papers and talking to some of the scientists who wrote them. But I always backed away because what they said made me feel disoriented and more anxious than I had been at the start. I focused on the work for another book, Chasing the Scream, the first and last days of the war on drugs instead. It sounds ridiculous to say I found it easier to interview hitmen for the Mexican drug cartels than to look into what causes depression and anxiety. But messing with my story about my emotions, what I felt and why I felt it, seemed more dangerous to me than that. And then finally, I decided I couldn't ignore it any longer. So over a period of 3 years, I went on a journey of over 40,000 miles. I conducted more than 200 interviews across the world with some of the most important social scientists in the world, with people who had been through the depths of depression and anxiety, and with people who had recovered. I ended up in all sorts of places I couldn't have guessed at in the beginning. An Amish village in Indiana, a Berlin housing project rising up in rebellion, a Brazilian city that had banned advertising, a Baltimore laboratory taking people back through their traumas in a totally unexpected way. What I learned forced me to radically revise my story about myself, my story about the distress spreading like tar over our culture. I want to flag up right at the start 2 things that shape the language I'm going to use through all of this book. I'm reading from the introduction. Both were surprising to me. I was told by my doctor that I was suffering from both depression and acute anxiety. I had believed those were separate problems, and that is how they were discussed for the 13 years I received medical care for them. But I noticed something odd as I did my research. Everything that causes an increase in depression also causes an increase in anxiety, and the other way around. They rise and fall together. It seemed curious, and I began to understand it only when, in Canada, I sat down with Robert Kohlenberg, a professor of psychology. He too once thought that depression and anxiety were different things. But as he studied it for over 20 years now, he discovered, he says, that the data are indicating that they're not distinct. In practice, quote, the diagnoses, particularly depression and anxiety, overlap, end quote. Sometimes one part is more pronounced than the other. You might have panic attacks this month and be crying a lot next month. But the idea that they're separate in the way that, say, having pneumonia and having a broken leg are separate is not borne out by the evidence. Robert's side of the argument has been prevailing in the scientific debate recently. In the past few years, the National Institutes of Health, the main body funding medical research in the United States, has stopped funding studies that present depression and anxiety as different diagnoses. They want something more realistic that corresponds to the way people are in actual clinical practice, he explains. I started to see depression and anxiety as like cover versions of the same song by different bands. Depression is a cover version by a downbeat emo band, and anxiety is a cover version by a screaming heavy metal group. But the underlying sheet music is the same. They're not identical, but they're twinned. The second insight comes from something else I learned as I studied these 9 causes of depression and anxiety that he writes about in this book. Whenever I wrote about depression and anxiety in the past, I started by explaining one thing. I am not talking about unhappiness. Unhappiness and depression are totally different things. There's nothing more infuriating to a depressed person than to be told to cheer up or to be offered jolly little solutions as if they were merely having a bad week. It feels like being told to cheer up yourself by going out dancing after you've broken both your legs. But as I studied the evidence, I noticed something that I couldn't ignore. The forces that are making us depressed and severely anxious are, at the same time, making even more people unhappy. It turns out that there is a continuum between unhappiness and depression. They're still very different in the same way that losing a finger in a car accident is different from losing an arm, and falling over the street is different from falling over the cliff. But they are connected. The book, Lost Connections by Johann Hari.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We're broadcasting live from the offices of The Nation magazine in New York City. And on the line with us is John Nichols, the national affairs correspondent for The Nation magazine. He's also the author of the new book, Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse, a field guide to the most dangerous people in America. The Nation's website, of course, is thenation.com. You can tweet John Nichols at Nichols Uprising. And John, welcome back to the program. It's been a while.
It has been. I'm honored to be with you, my friend.
It is great to have you on. We need to talk more often. I'm curious your thoughts on what's going on. You live in Wisconsin. It's your home state. You know Wisconsin politics better than anybody I know. Scott Walker got thrown out. I understand that they are preparing to do, unless I'm mixing my states up, what they did in, was it North Carolina, where as the incoming Democratic governor came in, they stripped him of the legislature, stripped that office of a whole bunch of powers that it had before he took office. Are they going to do that to, is it Tony Evers, the guy who beat Scott Walker? Am I remembering right?
Your memory is very good on about 1,000 fronts. It's Evers, not Evers. Evers, I only correct you because you want to be on our side of that pronunciation. The president got it wrong when he came to campaign for Scott Walker, and so we make the pronunciation central to our explanation here. It is Tony Evers, and he won by 30,000 votes. Not a landslide, but a solid victory. And remarkably, his victory came at the end of an intense campaign. And not only was Tony Evers elected, but so too was his running mate, Mandela Barnes, the first African-American lieutenant governor, a new attorney general, Josh Kaul, a great civil rights, voting rights activist, a new state treasurer, Sarah Godlewski, Secretary of State Doug Follett was reelected. Senator Tammy Baldwin was elected for the first time since 1982, Tom. Democrats won every constitutional office and the Senate seat at the same time, same election.
How about the Secretary of State, the person who runs the elections?
That's Doug LaFollette, and he's a Democrat, progressive Democrat.
Is he the heir to? Is he the grandson or great grandson?
No, he's a great
Fighting Bob.
It's a little
close enough.
More distant. Yeah, you're right. The name helps. He always runs ahead of the rest of the ticket. And so anyway, here's the big deal. There's no question what the voters said on Tuesday. They gave a clear indication, shifting all of the statewide contests, that they want a new direction for Wisconsin. And unfortunately, because our legislature is so overwhelmingly and radically gerrymandered, Republicans retain control of the state assembly and the state senate. Evers immediately said, as a longtime superintendent of public instruction, that he wanted to work with them, that he has worked with them, he's ready to go. Their response, the response from the Speaker of the State Assembly, was to say, oh, we suddenly realized the governorship is too powerful. It's got too much authority. And so we are thinking of using the lame duck session to change the powers of the governorship of Wisconsin. it really has sent shockwaves through the state, because I do know, as you correctly say, that something like this happened in North Carolina, but this is completely outside the character of historic Wisconsin politics by any measure. And so there's people are really everybody's on edge now. We're seeing whether they're actually going to try this. And I have to tell you, there's some question about whether Walker himself would go along with it, because I want to assure you the reaction has been so negative that if Scott Walker, as an outgoing governor, were to sign off on changes in powers that he himself accumulated, I think he already got beat. I think he would beat himself well into the future.
But if his goal is to take a job as a lobbyist for Koch Industries for $2 million a year and, and retire at the age of 60, a multimillionaire and, with a fortune to will to his children, he couldn't give a damn, right?
But this is the subtlety of Scott Walker. And you may be right. I can't get in his head, and I've battled him now, as you well know, often on your show for many years and been quite a critic of him. But my sense of Scott Walker is that he's obsessed with politics. He loves electoral politics. I think it was why he was such a miserable governor, because he put political ambitions above the day-to-day of governing. And so I believe that he has long-term ambitions. He's a young man, just 50. And so
you think he wants to run for the Senate at some point in the future or something like that?
Right. Senate or governor again. We have had a tradition in Wisconsin, people coming back and running for governor again. So I don't want to belabor Walker per se, but what I do want to tell you is that people here in Wisconsin are really ready to fight against this. And I was at a rally last evening on the steps of the Capitol. It was a rally regarding the Department of Justice and what has happened with Jeff Sessions and Whitaker and all that. But many of the speakers addressed what was going on inside the Capitol, including Congressman Mark Pocan, the co-chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, who said, we got these problems in Washington, but what they're talking about here in Wisconsin should be of perhaps not equal concern, but parallel concern, because it is a real threat to the basic premises of democracy.
Yeah. Specifically, what do they intend to do? They're talking about dialing back the powers of the governor. What? How? Where?
Very good question. Robin Voss, the Speaker of the State Assembly, and Scott Fitzgerald, the leader of the state, have historically to operate very much in the dark, very secretive. Fitzgerald has said, no, we're not talking about doing anything major. We might just change some of the appointment powers for the Economic Development Commission and things like that. They've made it very narrow in their definition. But the truth of the matter is that once you get into a special session, they have a long history of packing what are presented as very minor, innocuous changes with all sorts of radical shifts. Remember, Scott Walker himself, when he did Act 10, which is the law that assaulted labor rights in Wisconsin, that was a 133-page proposal, supposedly just to close a budget gap. And within it were dozens of proposals, and they shifted powers, they strengthened the governorship in all sorts of ways. They also had all sorts of real poison pills for unions, many of which were never even discussed. And so in this circumstance, what you have to look at, I would argue, is this. Three things. Dialing back the governor's authority to make appointments to state boards, commissions, cabinet, sub-level cabinet posts. The governor right now has a lot of ability to make appointments. Those appointments would allow Tony Evers to really change the direction of state government. And that's a big deal because Walker filled those posts often with very partisan players. The thing to understand about Evers is he's a good government guy. He is very, very passionate about filling those posts with scientists at the Department of Natural Resources and with experts in ethics that, like the other groups that oversee ethics.
The oversight. Yeah, right. That's pretty radical stuff, John.
I know it's crazy.
I mean, seriously, bringing scientists in to oversee, the environment and things that have to do with science?
My friend, just to let you understand this, you're right. We should, kind of mock it a little bit. But one of the biggest applause lines of Tony Evers on the campaign trail is, we're bringing science back to Wisconsin. Because under the Walker administration, they barred discussion of climate change in agencies that dealt with climate change, or at least dealt with, land use and other issues that might in some ways relate to it. This is a big deal. Who gets appointed, how appointments take place. There's a lot of power there. There's also, frankly, a lot of authority that the governor has as regards interpretation of bills, interpretation of things. And the main thing that you want here is, I can assure you, I've covered these people closely. Tony Evers, if you ever had a guy who was a good government guy who was willing to sit down with Republicans and say, yeah, maybe we should change that, he's the one. And so the deal here is, if they want to make changes, let them wait till January when the new governor is sworn in. They can talk about, these issues and sort them out. My deep fear is that they will attempt to radically disempower him, especially on appointments, perhaps, in key areas, and then keep their people in positions of authority to continue to advance their policies.
So Evers will run an administration, but he'll be surrounded by Republican toadies left over from the Walker administration that he can't get rid of because they're going to strip his power to do that. Is that in a nutshell what you're saying, John?
That's the threat.
Wow. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll keep an eye on it, and as things develop, keep an eye. Stay in touch with Sean and me, John, and I'd like to have you come back and keep us up to date on all of this. Plus, one of these days we've got to get into a conversation about national politics as well.
Heck of a lot going
John Nichols. There sure is. Thanks a lot, John.
Thank you.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
John's website, you can tweet him at Nichols Uprising. The website, of course, that he writes for, thenation.com. We'll be right back. Oh, welcome back. I'm sorry. I was. Where did the music go? Ah, yes, of course. We're back on the air. Donald in Los Angeles. Hey, Donald, what's on your mind today?
Hi, I wanted to talk to you about how people can prevent politicians being elected that they want to prevent being elected. Can we have a bit of a discussion about that?
Sure.
What's
your suggestion?
Imagine.
You're talking about how do we avoid local versions of Donald Trump? Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Imagine if there's a big fight going on, a bunch of animals, rabbit, lion, whatever, all fighting each other, and you're going to be attacked by whoever wins this fight. And you have the ability to help one of them win. Who are you going to help win? I mean, you're going to try to help the bunny rabbit? Like the bunny rabbit's going to beat the lion? No, you're going to pick the second scariest one because, and that's what we do in our elections. We help the second scariest one win because our psychology says that's the only one that can beat the scariest one. It happens all the time. What we need is the option to actually vote directly against the candidate so that we can at least have the option of saying, I want the scariest one not to win instead of I want the second scariest one to win. Am I making sense?
Yeah, but I'm not sure that the analogy is all that strong. I mean, I think that people vote for the candidate that they think best reflects their interests and hopes and aspirations.
Way to simply verify that that's not always the case.
Well, let me finish the sentence. But the problem that we have is that political advertising, which has broad First Amendment protection, I mean broader than pretty much any other thing in the media in the public sphere, political advertising regularly lies, particularly on the Republican side. I can't point to a single lie in a Democratic ad in the last election, but I can point to dozens of Republican lies.
Well, yeah, and one of the big reasons why there's so many lies in ads is because honesty isn't something that really matters in getting elected. What matters is how much they can scare you. Then that's really all they're aiming for is scare you as much as possible. In fact,
so what's your solution here, Don? What's your solution?
The solution is give people the option to actually vote against them. First off, we need to talk about the fact that option is lacking, because even just talking about it will make a big difference. Because
so you're suggesting that we change the ballot system from I don't like Donald Trump, so I'm voting for Hillary Clinton, or vice versa, to I don't like either one of them, so I'm saying no to both of them. Is that what you're saying?
Not exactly. You're getting closer. I'm saying
I don't understand.
Instead of just for Donald Trump, for Hillary Clinton, for Bernie Sanders, for whoever else, we should have for Hillary Clinton against Hillary Clinton, for Donald Trump against Donald Trump, for whatever, and actually be able.
How does that change the math?
To vote directly against the candidate if that's the voter's option, if that's their choice.
Yeah, Donald. Tighten your idea up a little so that you can explain it in 30 seconds, because I still don't understand why that's an advantage or how that would work, and we're out of time. But give me a call next week if you can, and I'm interested. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. On the line with us, Luke Vargas with Talk Media News. You can follow him on Twitter at The Courier. He's the chief foreign correspondent for Talk Media News, operating out of the UN in New York. And hey, Luke, what's going on in the world today?
Hey, Tom, actually quite a lot. I've been following and doing a bunch of interviews about this new asylum rule. I don't know if you've covered this already today, the clarification.
I have not.
Terrific. Well, let's recap it then. So we started learning about this last night. Became official this morning. It's a new executive order using the same authority that the president relied upon for his first travel bans, the ones that got struck down, as well as the one that has held up, to say that asylum seekers, those coming to the United States who want to lodge a legal claim for protection, fleeing all sorts of various situations around the world, will be blocked from making those asylum claims if they enter the United States at an irregular border crossing, which is to say entering the United States illegally. So this is a violation of international human rights law. It's crystal clear, according to the 1967 Refugee Protocol, that you cannot do this. It's also a pretty clear violation of the Immigration and Nationality Act, which says that aliens may lodge asylum claims, quote, not at a designated port of entry, end quote. So we are going to see a legal challenge here. I've talked to various teams of lawyers that say they are hours away from lodging their first challenges to this, which it looks like will probably be successful. The question is, if you keep running this through the courts in various ways, where does a particularly pro-Trump court, overturn those lower court objections? But this does seem to be.
Yeah, I was going to say this is exactly why Mitch McConnell is actively and aggressively packing the courts, and it's why the Republican Party has stopped asking the American Bar Association for their recommendations on highly qualified lawyers, and instead gone to this, billionaire-funded Federalist Society that literally catches these kids, young people in law school, and nurtures them from law school all the way up to the Supreme Court. It's why Brett Kavanaugh literally never tried a case as a lawyer, and never was a lower court judge. He went straight from being a lawyer for George W. Bush in the White House, straight from that right onto the appeals court in D.C., the second highest court in the land, purely political process.
And this, frankly, Luke, more than anything else that's happening right now, scares the absolute hell out of me. This is how Orban took over Hungary. This is how Erdogan took over Turkey. Both of them stripped the courts of their authority, or in the case of Turkey, he stripped the courts of their authority. In the case of Orban in Hungary, he packed the courts with his people. And Duterte is doing it in the Philippines right now. This is how democracies die.
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a long-term concern. I think in the immediate term, this will face difficulties at multiple levels of the justice system and perhaps may not be sustained. The law is so crystal clear here. I mean, I think this is, it's I think, right to point out differences between the travel ban and this, where the president does not have authority to be able to circumvent this in quite the same way he did, claiming, you know, he was trying to deal with terrorism, at least by my account. That doesn't mean he won't make that claim. So we'll see. But I think the particular concern here is that, you know, the administration may claim, hey, you know, we're trying to say that you just have to go through the legal protocols. You know, remember Trump saying, look, we're going to build the wall, but we're going to build a glorious door, and actually a big door, so that if you want to follow the proper protocols, you can. Well, it turns out we are not at all making it easy for people to apply for asylum legally. We are seeing huge backlogs at the borders. I think one report said the people reaching the San Diego border crossing, or one just out there the past few days, have been being told, come back in wait 45 days for us to be able to even take your paperwork in. In El Paso, there's a border crossing where people from various countries, depending on where they say they're from, are being told, we won't even take you at all. I think Guatemalans are just sort of being illegally told they can't even be considered. And in other places, we're hearing that this one major border crossing in Texas, the U.S. and Mexican governments are finalizing a plan. This was reported yesterday by Texas Monthly. They're finalizing a plan to basically kick out thousands of people who have been camping near the border, who are going every day to the border for weeks and keep being told, come back in a few days and maybe you'll have a better chance of getting your claim listened to. Now we're just basically turning the far side of the border into a no-go zone as well. So this seems that we have completely shut down legal channels into coming into this country, which will probably have the effect of drive people to make illegal crossings. The problem is if you are truly fleeing crisis and need asylum, and you decide, look, I'm not going to wait 45 days in San Diego. I can't support my family living on the street like that. Of course, that's dangerous. And so you decide to cross at an irregular border crossing. The impact after this executive order is that you may not only be deported, but you will then have a criminal record in the United States and lose access to the humanitarian protections that international law affords you. It's a triple whammy as far as I see it, and really just shows how much we have stepped away from sort of America's moral leadership on asylum policy. There's just, I think, no honest way the administration can claim anymore that these policies are designed to, our broader immigration policies are designed to take people out of harm's way from smuggling and other sorts of exploitation. Forcing people to wait weeks at the border just to make a legal claim is absurd. And if you want to fix this, the answer is not troops. The answer is more asylum people to go through paperwork, more judges to clear the backlog on these claims. And as people have explained it to me, and I'm sorry I'm ranting here, but I get pretty worked up, which is that, the one way, if this administration actually wanted to decrease fraudulent claims of asylum, which they think is a big problem, you should hire more judges to go through the paperwork. Because if there's an expectation that if you come to the U.S. and you have a bogus claim, it's going to be spotted really quickly. You're not going to spend months, in probation in the U.S. and then possibly have the chance to slip away. So the fix here should be on the administrative side, but of course that's not the way it's being dealt with.
Yeah, well, because Trump and Stephen Miller are committed to no more brown people in the United States, period. I mean, that's their mantra. And they're going 6 ways to Sunday to make it happen. Luke, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Yep, good talking with you. Luke Vargas, you can follow him on Twitter at The Courier. We'll be right
back. You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
Hey, thanks so much for your support for the Thom Hartmann Program, along with your support for Free Speech TV. We deliver our program, of course, to commercial stations, which is how we pay our bills through the revenue from running advertising, and you can learn more about those at our website at thomhartmann.com. But we also share our program with non-commercial outlets, from Free Speech TV to Pacifica stations all over the country. And because with the Pacifica radio stations, there's basically no revenue coming in, the way that we support our nonprofit outreach is in large part through Patreon. And, you know, over at Patreon, people who support our program at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. People who support our program there get, you know, special little clips, and there's a few other goodies, behind the scenes kind of stuff. But that's principally, if you want to support the Thom Hartmann Program, that's the way to do it, is to get over to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann and check out what we're doing and support our program. Thank you. Our book for today is Kickback, Exposing the Global Corporate Bribery Network by David Montero. This is from the introduction, Chapter 1. During Watergate, the appointment of a special prosecutor to investigate Richard Nixon's alleged tampering with elections was intended to mark the close of a sordid chapter in American history. Instead, that effort, culminating in Nixon's resignation, would prove to be only the beginning of a deeper political morass that America would face for decades to come. Congressional investigations would uncover for the first time that multinational corporations, through slush funds and bribes, were not only secretly funding political organizations at home, like Nixon's re-election campaign, but corrupting foreign officials abroad. This new perspective on the corporate abuse of power and its impact overseas would result in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FPCA, groundbreaking legislation that, by prohibiting commercial bribery for the first time in history, sought to change how capitalism and political affairs were conducted all around the world. Now, more than 40 years later, we are experiencing a kind of déjà vu as the special counsel investigates whether the president allegedly abused his power, again by obstructing an inquiry into a possible manipulation of our country's elections. Just as was the case in Watergate, whatever special counsel Robert Mueller uncovers will likely mark the beginning, rather than the end, of a reassessment of how power actually operates in this country. And just as in Watergate, there's the possibility that Mueller's far-reaching probe may reveal how tightly political corruption and corporate corruption are linked through bribery, just under the surface of America's political life. Nixon was the recipient of secret corporate donations, which were considered illegal because they should have been disclosed. But the payments, while unlawful, did not compromise the presidential election itself. Mueller's Russian inquiry is directed at a potentially far more serious crime, whether Donald Trump, the head of a sprawling business empire, colluded with a foreign power to deliberately sway the American electorate, committing the very crime that the FCPA had been trying to eradicate since Watergate, the offer of a foreign bribe, a kickback. That law specifically states that a corporate bribe need not involve an actual exchange of money. An offer of anything of value, such as a promise to a foreign government official, is sufficient to violate its terms. This is precisely what Mueller is trying to ascertain, whether Trump, his company, his associates, or his family, or some combination of them, offered a promise to Russian government officials, a quid pro quo, that if they helped Trump by manipulating the elections, Trump, if victorious, would ease U.S. sanctions against Russia. Doing so would allow greater U.S. investment of Russia and would benefit Russian officials and oligarchs, the Trump Business Organization, the corporate interests of the Trump family, and former members of his senior staff, including Paul Manafort, his one-time campaign chairman, and Michael Flynn, his disgraced national security advisor. If the Trump Organization or anyone connected with it did make such a promise, and depending on how that promise was conveyed to Russian officials, the Justice Department would have strong grounds for pursuing an FCPA charge, among others. An FCPA violation is within Mueller's mandate to investigate, quote, any matters that arose or may arise directly from this investigation. As has been widely observed, Mueller has hired 2 former federal law enforcement officials with extensive experience in investigating fraud, money laundering, and overseas bribery. Andrew Weissman, who ran the Justice Department's fraud section, which enforces the FCPA, and Greg Andres, who helped oversee FCPA policy in the criminal division. The drama playing out in Washington starkly highlights the fact that foreign corporate bribery can be a deeply misleading term. We have come to regard it, when we think of it at all, as something that unscrupulous companies do in distant countries, so that any impact it has must be contained overseas. If a corporation pays kickbacks to a greedy government official abroad, why should we be concerned? But in a highly interconnected world, bound together by a global market, a global financial system, and the constant migration of peoples, goods, capital, corruption rarely stays out there. Bribes eventually harm Americans, American society, American values, and American interests, both domestically and around the world, in ways that are difficult to gauge. Why do firms resort to bribery? The obvious reason is to gain an advantage over their competitors. But illicit payments also buy the illusion of growth in the short term, of increased market share and inflated firm value. It does not take into account the harm that this practice causes to companies themselves, sinking employee morale, diminished profit margins, and the possibility of hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and penalties, not to mention a reputation that will be associated with corruption and deceit. They also effectively steal the public's money because the majority of bribery cases involve capital-intensive development and infrastructure projects such as roads, dams, defense systems, oil extraction, or mining that are publicly funded. To recoup the bribes involved in winning such contracts, companies conspire with foreign officials to inflate the costs, sometimes by 10 or even hundreds of millions of dollars. While the companies and the officials win out, taxpayers are left shouldering the burden. Corporate bribes involve a remarkable amount of money. The World Bank has estimated $1 trillion a year, although this may represent the high end. Others have placed the market at 10% of the $4 trillion spent annually on global public procurement. The book Kickback by David Montero.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Kindness of the hand.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. It's Anything Goes Friday. We're finished with our guests for the day. I'm broadcasting live today from the Nation Magazine's conference room, and thank you to them for letting us set up here. We had a fascinating conversation in our first hour, with a half-hour conversation with Katrina Vanden Heuvel, the publisher of The Nation. The Nation was first published in 1865. It's an institution, The Nation magazine, and an extraordinary one, a truly extraordinary one. The website is thenation.com. And I just got an email from the Donald Trump campaign. Of course, you know the campaign, they've been raising money for his re-election, 2020 re-election, literally since the day after he was inaugurated, which has never happened before. And the campaign has been using a lot of that money to pay for Don Jr.'s legal bills, Jared Kushner's legal bills, Ivanka's legal bills, Donald's legal bills, you know, all these crimes and frauds and whatnot. You know, these poor suckers who get these emails like I get. Dear Fred Flintstone. In this one he says, Ron DeSantis got nearly 40,000 more votes than socialist Andrew Gillum. See, even describing his opponents, he has to lie, right? I mean, Andrew Gillum never called himself a socialist. Anyhow, Ron DeSantis got nearly 40,000 more votes than socialist Andrew Gillum in the Florida governor's race. Rick Scott, over 15,000 more votes than Bill Nelson in the Senate race. But we're likely being forced, and forced is in all caps, like, oh my God, those poor little snowflakes, into a mandated recount. We're sending a team of reliable supporters to oversee the entire recount process to ensure it's done fairly, and we must raise $247,867 by 11:59 p.m. to fully fund our Florida grassroots recount fund. Oh, man. You know, when you've got a grifter in the White House, you shouldn't be surprised, I suppose, when most of the email that you get from them is a grift. It's a con. You know, this guy is like just a con man. I don't know how to say it beyond that. It's just, it's truly remarkable. Holy cow, what's going on here? I don't know what's going on with this. Sean, if Nate could run over and look at my computer, I've got some kind of an error message on here that I don't know what to make of. Okay, just please tell me if my computer looks normal or, yeah, okay, thank you. So that's what was going on. Okay, great, thank you, Nate. I got it back. All right, let's pick up your phone calls here. Margaret in Aberdeen, Washington. Hey, Margaret, what's on your mind today?
Oh, hello, Tom. Thank you again. I truly believe you should be a national treasure. I am energized about the midterm elections and the mass protest. I have hope again. After the 2016 election, when I finally got out of the fetal position and off the sofa, the last 2 years, I've educated myself by participating at home, by calling senators and representatives, donating to environmental organizations, and I actually had my first letter to the county newspaper published. But now I'm ready to hit the pavement and join the protest and participate and support progressive campaigns. And as far as the election results for Abrams, O'Rourke, and Gillum, they were extremely close results. Even if they ultimately lose, their voices were heard, and they won't be silenced. And finally, I want to make one comment. I do watch Hannity once a week to get the alt-right's radical views. Last night, he opened with the Tucker Carlson protest. Rick Scott claiming that Democrats are trying to steal the Florida Senate, the support of Whitaker as the Attorney General, and bashing the press. He only spent about 30 seconds on the Thousand Oaks mass murder killings, the California fires, or the national protest against Whitaker. It's all fear, fear, fear. Now, Trump blames PTSD, and why not? We continually train young men to kill, not to mention Big Pharma prescribing antidepressants. I, too, was on antidepressants after my husband died, but since I started using marijuana, I have ceased taking antidepressants. And I was just wondering, do you think possibly the legalization of marijuana has a part to play in raising the consciousness of the new wave of young, diverse candidates?
There's a couple of answers on different levels that occur to me on that, Margaret. The first is that, yeah, in those places where legal marijuana was on the ballot, like in Michigan, I think that having pot decriminalization on the ballot actually increased the Democratic vote, the young vote, basically, which is largely, it's about a 60% Democratic vote. So, electorally, that's a good thing. With regard to the mass shootings, one of the things that we now know, it's not universal, at least as far as we know, because medical records are typically sealed. But we've had a couple of psychiatrists on this program. There's one in particular who's very outspoken on this issue and has written books about it. Peter Breggin is his name. He's an MD psychiatrist, and he wrote a book called Talking Back to Prozac, and among others. And he has come on this program and argued that many of these mass shooters are on these SSRI antidepressants. And what they do, the way that they work, is what's called flattening affect. In other words, they decrease the intensity of emotions. And, for somebody who's going through a crisis, like you talked about your husband dying, I mean, I can't imagine if Louise were to die. I would probably turn to a pharmaceutical, or at least consider it seriously. And, but the problem is that they're so hard to withdraw from, that people get into long-term use of them, and they continue to have lost their affect, that is, their emotional intensity. And part of affect, part of that is the ability to empathize with other people, to view other people as human beings. So his argument
Peter Bregen's argument is that some of these shooters literally don't see the people they're killing as human beings. They see them as objects in a video game, and because of the drugs that they're on. I can't say that that's absolutely true. I know that it's theoretically absolutely possible, and we don't know if this shooter, if he was I believe Iraq War vet, maybe Afghanistan, and a Marine, whether he had PTSD or not, and whether he was being treated with pharmaceuticals or not, we just don't know. But the idea that people could transition off them with pot, that's intriguing. You're the first person I've heard that from, Margaret. Was it fairly easy to leave behind the antidepressants and move to the pot?
Yeah, I weaned myself. I did it carefully. I would cut them in half and then quarter them over a 6-week period. So
and that's how you're supposed to do it, I guess.
I did it carefully.
Yeah.
And ever since marijuana became legal in Washington, I hadn't smoked marijuana in probably 40, 50 years, and mainly because it was illegal. But and now I use it maybe once or twice a week, the edibles, and I find I enjoy it.
Yeah, I use it to get to sleep at night, typically a couple nights a week, and I find it very useful, and it's a hell of a lot safer than sleeping pills, and the side effects are nowhere near as bad. So I'm just so pleased that it's happening all across the country. Margaret, thanks for sharing your experience with us and for a really provocative question. I appreciate it. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Anything Goes Friday, live from New York, taking your calls right after this. And welcome back. And let's see here, Jeff in Portland, Oregon, listening on X-Ray FM. Hey, Jeff, what's on your mind?
Happy Friday, Tom. Thanks for taking my call and giving us a great show from the road. And as you document so eloquently on a daily basis, the last 40 years, the Republican Party, we've seen them merge together their greed and lust for power in unprecedented ways. I'd say if Richard Nixon was a pimple on the face of our democracy, the current so-called president is a melanoma, a malignant outgrowth of the last 4 decades. And Tom, I think a quote from FDR's Vice President Henry Wallace, who you quote a lot, sums up where we are with this guy in the Oval Office. And Wallace said, quote, "A fascist is one whose lust for money or power is combined with such an intensity of intolerance toward those of other races, parties, classes, religions, cultures, or nations as to make him ruthless in his use of deceit or violence to attain his ends." And my big question for you, Tom, besides listening to and learning from your show, at this critical juncture, what steps should we be taking on a personal and political level to inoculate ourselves and our country from the ongoing damage to the democracy and economy that will keep coming until we can get this guy out?
Yeah. What we have right now, Jeff, and we need to just look at this with, a cold, hard look. It's like, looking ourselves in the mirror and saying, okay, we're going to turn the lights up and figure this out. We have a political party, the Republican Party, that is committed to the kind of fascism that Vice President Henry Wallace talked about in that June 7, 1944 op-ed piece in the New York Times. We absolutely have that. And we have, on the Democratic Party side, we've got a party that is about half very, very committed to good government, progressive ideals, what some folks would even refer to as, maybe democratic socialism or something like that. And we have the other half of the Democratic Party, roughly, and it varies from state to state pretty wildly, but I'm talking nationally here. The other half of the Democratic Party is, in the thrall of banks and insurance companies and pharmaceutical companies and things like that, but they are not committed to fascism. So, the Democratic Party, although not perfect, this is the result of the system we have from the Supreme Court's decisions in Buckley and First National Bank in '76 and '78 through Citizens United, combined with Bill Clinton and Al Fromm's decision to go in big with the big corporations in order to get enough money to win an election back in '92. We have a Democratic Party that's not perfect, but it is not committed to fascism. In fact, if anything, even the most corporatist of the Democrats are committed to stopping fascism. So in answer to, that's all preamble to what I think is a very simple answer to your question, Jeff, which is that all of us who care about the future of this country need to get inside the Democratic Party. And I'm not talking about just vote for the Democrats. I'm talking about show up at your local party meeting, show up at your local, and not just show up regularly, and start offering to, offer to become a precinct committee person if you have the time and the inclination. Start looking for leadership positions in the Democratic Party. We need to turn the Democratic Party has the potential to literally save this country. And it's not going to happen if we don't step up and do it. And we need to push the lobbyists out of the way, and the people who are indebted to the lobbyists eventually will fall away as more progressive candidates come in. And that, not only is that the way we have to do it, but I'm very optimistic that we can do it that way. Jeff, thanks for the call.
Hey, thanks so much for your support for the Thom Hartmann Program, along with your support for Free Speech TV. We deliver our program, of course, to commercial stations, which is how we pay our bills through the revenue from running advertising, and you can learn more about those at our website at thomhartmann.com. But we also share our program with non-commercial outlets, from Free Speech TV to Pacifica stations all over the country. And because with the Pacifica radio stations, there's basically no revenue coming in, the way that we support our nonprofit outreach is in large part through Patreon. And, over at Patreon, people who support our program at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. People who support our program there get, special little clips, and there's a few other goodies, behind the scenes kind of stuff. But that's principally, if you want to support the Thom Hartmann Program, that's the way to do it, is to get over to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann and check out what we're doing and support our program. Thank you.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook.
Thom Hartmann here with you. Just read an ad for Blink. I didn't realize that these are these motion sensor cameras but in fact we just put a camera system into our house, but these are battery operated. The batteries run for up to 2 years. That's pretty impressive. Anyhow, picking up your phone calls, Maine in Chicago. Hey, Maine, thanks for listening to CPT.
Hey,
what's up?
Hey, how you doing, Tom? Yeah, I just wanted to talk about how we have to tackle such issues like trickle-down voodoo Rangoon economics. I mean, without these major changes where we come from the bottom and out the middle again, or however it was before it was trickle-down, and then we have this second trickle-down that Trump Pansy just did with another $1.5 trillion tax break for the rich, and in doing that, oh man.
I'm listening.
We have to fight them. Yeah, we have to fight them back with issues, such as free education, free health care, and stop the privatization, of our schools and other different things in our democracy. In order to put our democracy in steel, iron, and concrete, we have to have certain issues that we go toe-to-toe on, just like they're going toe-to-toe on privatization and things like that, in order to cause us to pay for our democracy. And we shouldn't have to pay for our democracy in such a way.
Yeah, absolutely agree, Maine. The Republican Party has a commitment to voter suppression in order to maintain power, to cutting taxes for rich people, and to deregulation and privatization. That's their three-legged stool, and all three of those things are extremely toxic and destructive of democracy and what I would call nakedly fascist. The Democratic parties right now, the three pillars of the Democratic Party are health care,
Let's fix the ACA as a starting point, and let's work toward Medicare for all. Jobs, which includes a giant infrastructure bill to put America, back in shape and put people back to work with good paying jobs. And that also includes re-empowering unions and pushing for a $15 minimum wage. And the culture of corruption in Washington, D.C., which means taking on the corrupt voting practices that the Republican Party is promulgating, taking on the corruption that's happening in the White House, and taking on the corruption that we see throughout the Republican Party, where basically every piece of legislation the Republicans propose was written for them by some lobbyist from some corporation that's making big contributions to their campaign. And I think that that's a solid platform. What's missing from it, in my opinion, is education, what you mentioned, Maine, and I think you're spot on that. And I suppose the problem is that that's something that young people care about a lot. Older people, maybe not so much, although older people are paying for a lot of young people's college. It just must not have polled as high. And I think that's because it's kind of crept up on us. It's like old farts like me who remember, back when you could go to college by, working in a gas station in the summers and pay your college tuition at a major university. And of course now you can't, you could work a full-time job and still wouldn't be able to pay your tuition at a major university. So I am hopeful that education gets added, but one of the things that political consultants have learned over the years is that three things, people can easily remember three things. You get beyond that and people's eyes start glazing over. So you build things into those three things, like that culture of corruption thing has three pieces to it. I just don't see where education fits in right now at the top of their list, but I suspect it's gonna climb. Maine, excellent points all. Thank you very much. Danita in Bremerton, Washington. Hey, Danita, what's up?
Thank you very much, Tom, for taking my call, and thank you for what you do. You've inspired me and so many people to get off the couch or get out the crying rag. My husband and I went to see Michael Moore's movie when it first came out, and we were devastated. The next morning we woke up and we did something. We volunteered for Initiative 1639, and we're just so thrilled. People work so hard, and I'm so proud of Washington State voters. 60% of the voters passed this initiative. This is the only initiative that was even presented for election in the country. And
Danita, what does that initiative do?
What this initiative does is it extends a 10-day waiting period. It
for buying guns.
Buy a gun. It expands the background checks. It raises the age to buy automatic or semi-automatic weapon to 21, which is we've had anyway for handguns. It requires training, and it also requires responsibility in your storage and handling of weapons. I was a medical photographer in the Navy, and I photographed children who had found guns in their parents' nightstands. I photographed people for murders and people who committed suicide. Various situations of gun violence. My brother was a Marine, and he also committed suicide. And so this is very dear to my heart. And St. James in the Bible even says, faith without deeds is dead. And so we need prayer and action. Well, and so thank you, Tom.
Good on you, Danita. And this passed, right? This passed?
Yes, it did. By God, it
God
did.
bless you.
Thank you, everybody.
That's wonderful. Danita, good on you.
Program. Call 202-808-9925.
That is one of the most inspiring things I've heard all day. Danita, thank you so much. And I can't thank you enough. We'll be back. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Carbon Shock, A Tale of Risk and Calculus on the Front Lines of a Disrupted Global Economy by Mark Shapiro. This is from the introduction. Chaos, uncertainty, unpredictability. Those are the characteristics of the natural world under the pressures being wrought by climate change. Normal patterns of rainfall, temperature, and extreme weather are changing so rapidly that past baselines for these primordial forces are less and less relevant. Scientists have a word for this state of flux. They call it, quote, the end of stationarity, end quote, a term with a powerful meaning. We can no longer rely on past events to predict future probabilities. The ground is shifting beneath our feet. Now it's becoming increasingly clear that the volatility we're seeing in our natural world is reshaping our financial world too. While we try to hold on to our bearings in the status quo and conduct business as usual, new risks are entering into the equation and new costs are creeping out of the balance sheets of corporations and nations. Just as chaotically as climate change is altering conditions here on Earth, it is changing our understanding of the actual costs of just about everything. In the financial realm, as in the natural realm, the past provides fewer and fewer clues to our future. Like the migration patterns of songbirds that no longer correlate to the hatching patterns of their insect prey, or the mountain snowpacks that no longer store water for the dry summer months. The economy is facing similar miscues born of the interactive loop between tumult in the atmosphere and tumult on the earth. Economic calculations are being upended in ways that are similar to how the digital revolution transformed financial decision-making, though on a far more monumental scale. In early 2014, a report by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produced and reviewed by more than 1,000 scientists and approved by 194 governments, identified the economic impact of the enormous changes underway. Slowing the rate of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere would not have devastating impacts on the economy, as is often feared, but would require a fundamental rethinking of our priorities and of our existing business models. Unstated but clearly implied, new forces will rise and others will fall as the true costs of carbon become an increasingly potent economic factor that can no longer be ignored. In 2013, an insurance industry research association called for an entirely new paradigm for assessing risk because rapid-fire changes in weather and temperature are outpacing traditional actuarial calculations. In other words, we are on the threshold of carbon shock. There are 5 greenhouse gases. Together, these gases of related, though different provenance, are in a circuit of relationships that give them the same ultimate impact, trapping heat in the Earth's lower atmosphere, giving rise to the greenhouse effect. Up from the center of the Earth comes a 100-billion-year-old periodic table of decaying organic fossils in the form of carbon dioxide and methane, embedded in oil, coal, and natural gas, thus the terms fossil fuels. From the combustion of these ancient fossils comes O3, also known as ozone, derived from the interaction of sunlight with CO2 and other hydrocarbons, and O2, nitrous oxide, which in addition to being emitted from, from industrial sources, is also contained in fertilizers and released from soil through agricultural tilling, and a synthesized family of hydrofluorocarbons generated as waste products from the production of other chemicals, primarily refrigerants and pesticides. In the gas world, they are all cousins, baton passers of molecular reaction that conspire to create turmoil in the heavens. Carbon dioxide is by far the most abundant, which is why carbon has become a stand-in reference for all greenhouse gases. It's not that carbon hasn't always had a cost. It's just that, until now, carbon's costs have been, for the most part, invisible. We haven't been accounting for them. Just as an optical illusion tricks the eye into seeing something that's not there, traditional accounting diverts our attention from invisible costs. We only see profits. Keeping these costs a mystery has been fundamental to our economic growth. Businesses benefit from a false ledger in which the environmentally corrosive impacts of the energy they use to produce, distribute, and dispose of everything from almonds to automobiles have been dramatically undercounted. 3,000 of the world's biggest companies, according to the United Nations report, could lose a third or more of their value if calculations of profits included the actual environmental costs. Most of these costs are the result of greenhouse gases emitted from the burning of fossil fuels, from which 82% of the world's energy is derived. Unlike smog or smoke or other acute contaminants, you can't necessarily see greenhouse gas pollution, but we are the involuntary recipients of its steadily expanding effects. These effects come to us fractured in scattered reports of distress, polar bears floating off on melting glaciers, hurricanes tearing into distant coastlines, droughts sending farmers into panic, remote island states sinking into the seas. When, in the summer of 2013, a gas chromatograph perched atop the Mauna Loa volcano in Hawaii reported that the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere had, for the first time, reached 400 parts per million, it not only triggered alarm bells from scientists, but signaled costs to come. The world's two biggest economies, the United States and the European Union, estimate hundreds of billions of dollars in cost from heat waves, floods, and an accelerating flow of refugees fleeing lands in which they can no longer sustain themselves. Both classify climate change as one of the foremost challenges to political stability. The book Carbon Shock, a tale of risk and calculus on the front lines of a disrupted global economy. Hey, thanks so much for your support for the Thom Hartmann Program, along with your support for Free Speech TV. We deliver our program, of course, to commercial stations, which is how we pay our bills through the revenue from running advertising, and you can learn more about those at our website at thomhartmann.com. But we also share our program with non-commercial outlets, from Free Speech TV to Pacifica stations all over the country. And because with the Pacifica radio stations, there's basically no revenue coming in, the way that we support our nonprofit outreach is in large part through Patreon. And, you know, over at Patreon, people who support our program at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. People who support our program there get, you know, special little clips, and there's a few other goodies, behind the scenes kind of stuff. But that's principally, if you want to support the Thom Hartmann Program, that's the way to do it, is to get over to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann and check out what we're doing and support our program. Thank you.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Griffith, Indiana.
Cool. What's up?
Yes, I wanted to talk about Jeff Sessions. Is it time for the Democrats to really take a close look at Jeff Sessions now, since they'll have subpoena power? And since he got fired, he wants to talk. Maybe he wants to talk.
Well, we'll see. I mean, his resignation letter, although he acknowledged that he'd been fired in it, first sentence, in fact, went on to talk about how wonderful Donald Trump was and how much he loves to shine his shoes and how much he does everything but comb the guy's hair. So I'm guessing that Sessions is hoping for a political future beyond this. Although I don't know, he's an old man. Maybe he's going to retire. But typically what Republicans do is they get a job on a board of a corporation that pays them $1 million a year, and that's their payoff for having helped those corporations all those years. And Jeff Sessions sure has a lot of chits that he can turn in, a lot of markers from when he was a senator, and he was helping corporations in a really, really big way. But the fact of the matter is, Russell, what you're pointing out is that Jeff Sessions lied to Congress in his confirmation hearings. He flat up lied. They asked him, I believe it was Ron Wyden, asked him straight up, Senator, have you had any contact with Russians when you were running or participating in the Trump transition team or participating in the campaign? And Jeff Sessions, of course, was the first senator to endorse Donald Trump. And Sessions said to the senator who asked him that question, "No, sir, I've had no contact with the Russians." And then he had to later, when the evidence came out, he had to say, "Well, yeah, I guess I did." And that's why he recused himself from the Mueller investigation. So he has openly admitted, essentially, that he lied to Congress, but he's paid no penalty for it. And, this happened in the Senate, so it would probably be the Senate that would have to go after him. And with these corrupt fascist Republicans running the Senate, I'm not holding my breath. I'm not sure if the House can call him, and, if House oversight has, presumably, theoretically, they have the power to, to issue a subpoena for any witness for any reason, but I don't know if that would work. But I would sure love to see Jeff Sessions held to account. Hell, I'd love to see the tobacco executives who lied to Congress back, 30 years ago held to account. Some of them are still around. Michael in Princeton, Minnesota. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Yeah, you may have answered my question on the prior caller. What I had a question about was, what can we do about the Kavanaugh appointment there to the Supreme Court? And part of the reason that I'm a little bit concerned about that, is with Ruth Bader Ginsburg laid up now. If anything happens to her, heaven forbid, but she's old, that would give Trump a third appointment. And we know from what you've said, that he lied to get into his prior job. Is there any way that they can go after him? I imagine the Senate probably has to do that.
Yeah, I believe. I mean, I'm not a parliamentarian. This is a question that probably even your average member of Congress might not know the answer to, but the answer is out there. And in fact, help me remember here, y'all, or somebody call in next week if Ro Khanna is on Monday. I'm not sure if he is or not, and when Mark Pocan is on Wednesday, to ask them this question: can the House investigate things that happened before the Senate, lying to the Senate, as Brett Kavanaugh did back in 2004 and again in 2006, and as I believe he lied to the Senate this time. But we don't have the exact evidence of that. We have clear evidence that he lied to the Senate back before. So number one, there are two things that can be done about Brett Kavanaugh. The first is to investigate him, investigate his corruption, investigate his past, investigate his lies to the Senate, and if enough is found, I mean, keep in mind, all those years he worked in the Bush White House, we saw not one document. And he was overseeing torture, he was overseeing rendition, he was overseeing Guantanamo, he was overseeing a lot of stuff. He was hanging out there with John Yoo and Jay Bybee and just, making life miserable for helping kill people. So number one, look into that. And number two, it is within the power of Congress, and frankly, I think that this will happen after the 2020 election, when hopefully we'll have a Democratic House, a Democratic Senate, and a Democratic President. It is within the power of Congress to change the composition of the Supreme Court, that is, the number of people on the court. There's a debate about whether it's legal for them to even have a retirement age for Supreme Court justices. They wouldn't actually retire. They would move on to another federal bench, because the Constitution, the opening, kind of the preamble to Article 3, which defines in the Constitution, which defines the judiciary, starts right out basically saying the justices, shall serve during times of good behavior. It doesn't say for life, but that's so obvious. I mean, that's clearly what they meant, and Hamilton talks about it in Federalist 79, 80, and 81. So, Article 3, Section 2 says that Congress, or the Supreme Court, shall be operating under regulations and exceptions defined by Congress. And so if you go back to the Andrew Johnson presidency, when Lincoln was assassinated, at that point in time there were 10 members of the U.S. Supreme Court. And Congress was controlled by the Republicans, both the House and the Senate. And Andrew Johnson, who was a slaveholder, in fact, the first slave he bought was a young girl, she was 14 years old, named Dolly, and he had 3 children by her. And this is not like some recent revelation. At the time, people knew this. He bragged about it. In fact, the story that he told, Andrew Johnson told, was that Dolly asked him to buy her because she liked the way he looked. And so when Andrew Johnson, I mean, this is Lincoln's biggest mistake, was having a bipartisan cabinet and having a Democrat, at that time the Democrats were the party of slavery, on his ticket. When Andrew Johnson became president, the Republicans in the House and Senate, the anti-slavery Republicans in the House and Senate said, uh-oh, this is not going to be good. And so they passed a law changing the number of members of the U.S. Supreme Court to 6. Now, you can't fire a sitting Supreme Court member, but what this was designed to do was, if anybody died or anybody resigned during Andrew Johnson's presidency, he would not be able to replace them unless more than 4 of them died or resigned. And then after Andrew Johnson left office, the first thing that Congress did when Ulysses S. Grant was sworn in whatever year it was, I think it's 1872 as I recall, but it might have been 1868. But anyhow, the first thing Congress did when Grant was sworn in was they changed the number of members of the Supreme Court back up to 9. And it's stood there at 9 ever since. So there's quite a precedent for Congress changing. I mean, everybody knows that FDR tried to do this in '37 and didn't. It wasn't that he failed. The Chief Justice, whose name was Hughes, and his sidekick, the 2 most right-wing members
of the U.S. Supreme Court in 1937, where Chief Justice Hughes, I think it was Evan Hughes, and his sidekick, whose last name was Roberts, ironically, and I don't remember his first name. And Hughes and Roberts in 37 all of a sudden started voting with FDR. I mean, they just literally changed their judicial philosophy overnight because they were confronted with the possibility that FDR was going to, pack the court. He was going to take it up to 13 members. And they would start losing, so they got ahead of it. So I think that, with all that precedent and the fact that it's been done before and that FDR could have pulled it off, and you can read about this in the book about Frances Perkins, the woman who created the New Deal. I think that we could do something about it. Does that make sense? Have I answered your question, Michael?
Well, you sure did allay some of my fears, especially after Nancy Pelosi, said that we're going to look forward from here. And I thought, well, if they're not going to investigate anything, I thought, oh my gosh, what happens if Trump gets another one? But I really appreciate your explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome, Michael, and I appreciate the call. We have a little less than a minute right now. It wouldn't be fair to put a caller on, and we're going to hit a hard break. So let me just expand on that. If we get control of the House, Senate, and White House, and if the Democrats don't put the filibuster back into place for things like this, then this could be done with a simple majority in the House and Senate. The U.S. Constitution does not require a supermajority for Congress to regulate the Supreme Court. It simply says the Supreme Court shall operate under regulations defined by and under exceptions defined by Congress. Article 3, Section 2, you can look it up and read it. And so this is something that we need to be talking about. The reason this is all top of mind for me right now, and I'm remembering Hughes and Roberts' names and everything else, is that right now, not literally as we speak, but tonight when I get home, or this weekend, I'm writing a book about the Supreme Court, which will be out in probably the fall of next year or early in 2020. And I've just been up to my eyeballs in this stuff. And I'm not quite as panicked as a lot of other people are.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
The thing that does concern me are what are referred to as the inferior courts, the federal courts of appeal and the federal district courts. Trump and McConnell are packing them right now with right-wing crazies. And welcome back. And Sharon in Garland, Texas. Hey, Sharon, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, long-time listener here. Thank you so much for what you do. And a super quick shout-out to all my lunchtime buddies in the YouTube chat. I wanted to get your opinion on if you think progressive Democrats running as Republicans in future elections is a good strategy. I think it's a two-point strategy. First, it would allow Republican voters to hear more about it would let them hear more about the progressive agenda, Medicare for all, college-free tuition, and ending the drug war, to name a few. But two, which is the most important and I think would be the most delicious to witness, is that it would force the Republican candidates to go against all of that. Do you think that would be a big waste of time and effort, or do you think it would be an effective at returning our government to one that represents the citizenry? Thank you.
I think you're welcome, Sharon. I think if it was done gratuitously, hey, we're going to do this as a slick trick. We can pull it off on the Republicans. It'll make them look bad, or it'll make them confront things, or whatever. I think it would not only fail, but it would backfire. On the other hand, the Republican Party actually does have a progressive tradition. Teddy Roosevelt was the peak of that progressive tradition, and arguably Abraham Lincoln. And so my dad was not a progressive Republican, but he wasn't a crazy Republican. He was an Eisenhower Republican. There still are, and we've got this guy who calls into the show every other week or so, talking about the moose tippers, moose wranglers, moose whatever, on a play on moose herders. That's right. Thank you, Sean. And he's a Republican down in Florida, as I recall. And he's talking about getting the Republican Party, getting some progressives in the Republican Party. So if somebody came along like him, somebody, or a politician, somebody with political skills who had grown up in the Republican Party, who believed in some of the things that the Republican Party, at least historically, has given lip service to. I mean, the classic definition of conservatism, William F. Buckley once said, what a conservative does is stand astride the arc of history with his hand out shouting, "Stop." And my dad would have said, "Slow down." The idea that you know, one of the positive ideas that Russell Kirk put forward, and there were several positive ideas in his book, The Conservative Mind, which I reference a lot back in 1951, was the idea that progress should happen, right? That the country should move forward, that's been the history of our country literally since its founding, is we've always moved forward, we've always had progress. You know, we started out in some fairly grim places, particularly for people of color, and we've gotten better and better and better. We still have a hell of a long way to go, but you know, this is a possibility. And so if there was somebody who came along who, you know, a Meghan McCain, for example, who grew up in the Republican Party, a Nicole Wallace, although I don't know much about her politics beyond that, a Steve Schmidt. You know, some of these Republicans, maybe even a David Jolly, some of these Republicans who you see popping up on MSNBC all the time now, who are not just anti-Trump. I mean, the anti-Trump Republicans are easy to find, but have gone beyond anti-Trump to being actually, you know, holding some reasonable and positive positions. Then I think there could be a real shakeup in the Republican Party. And those people might give some of the corporate Democrats a real run for their money. So, you know, that's going to depend on the Republican Party, though, shaking out of this cult that it's being held by of Donald Trump and the Koch brothers. But, you know, time passes, things change, so I wouldn't give up on it.
Hey, thanks so much for your support for the Thom Hartmann Program, along with your support for Free Speech TV. We deliver our program, of course, to commercial stations, which is how we pay our bills through the revenue from running advertising, and you can learn more about those at our website at thomhartmann.com. But we also share our program with non-commercial outlets, from Free Speech TV to Pacifica stations all over the country. And because with the Pacifica radio stations, there's basically no revenue coming in, the way that we support our nonprofit outreach is in large part through Patreon. And, you know, over at Patreon, people who support our program at patreon.com/Thom Hartmann. People who support our program there get, you know, special little clips, and there's a few other goodies, behind the scenes kind of stuff. But that's principally, if you want to support the Thom Hartmann Program, that's the way to do it, is to get over to patreon.com/Thom Hartmann and check out what we're doing and support our program. Thank you.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thank you.
Anything Goes Friday. Ron in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Hey, Ron, what's on your mind today?
Thanks for taking my call. Michael Moore is calling for Tom Hanks to run for president against Trump. He's asked Hanks twice to put his hat in the ring, but he's been turned down. He's hoping the third time will be the charm. And Moore, as you know, is a very sophisticated political analyst. So he's saying, who would vote against Tom Hanks? Anyhow, I just wondered what your feeling might be on that.
Wow. I don't know enough about Tom Hanks's past or even his present politics to know if there might be some landmines floating around, you know, some previous indiscretions.
Well, there always could be.
You know.
But, you know, we caught him on the Axelrod show, The Axe, where he did an hour on him, and he came across so believable and seemed very ethical.
You're talking, you caught Tom Hanks or you caught Michael Moore?
No, Michael Moore. Right. I'm sorry. On the David Axelrod show, The Axe, he had Tom Hanks on for an hour.
Oh, he did?
Oh, he did, and it was a terrific interview. If you can look it up, it'd be great. But anyhow, he came across very believable, very ethical. And the most ironic thing, who do you think he's a cousin to? A distant cousin, Abraham Lincoln. Apparently, Tom Hanks's mother was Abraham Lincoln's mother was a Hanks. So
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, I had two things to say in response to what you were saying. The first was, I don't know enough about Tom Hanks to know. You're reassuring me somewhat here, Ron. And the second was that I agree with you that Michael Moore is one of our more astute political observers in this country. And if he says it, it could be true. I'm not ruling. I wouldn't rule it out at all.
I think of some of the roles he's played. That's deeply embedded in our collective consciousness. You know, Philadelphia, Sully, Saving Private Ryan, Castaway. And the other thing is, you know, Republicans have run two celebrity candidates, Reagan and Trump, and both won. So maybe we should give it a shot and think outside the box, at least give it some consideration. Hopefully,
although Reagan was a governor first, but Reagan was a governor first, and Trump is giving us some evidence that having a celebrity in the White House with no governing experience is a disaster. But that said, you know, he could probably overcome that.
Yeah,
that's interesting. That's real interesting. Ron, let me ponder that, and I'll go looking for his podcast, right? It's called The Axe, David Axelrod's.
Well, Axelrod's program is on, I believe it was C-SPAN, CNN, and it's called The Axe File. It's on once a week, on Sunday or Saturday night.
Okay, yeah, I'll see if I can track it down.
I'd encourage you to look at him. He's really a very impressive guy, and you know, it'd be at least something for the public to consider.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. Ron, thanks a lot for the call. That's fascinating. I did not know that. Thank you for that, Ron. Rick in Hartford, Wisconsin. Hey, Rick, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. A couple of minutes ago, you mentioned something about education perhaps not being as big an issue for voters these days. And if I've got that wrong, I apologize. But I just wanted you and your listeners to know that here in Wisconsin, we just elected a Democratic governor who was our superintendent of public schools a few years back. And along with that, all of the local school referendums that were on the ballot across the state passed. So I think at least here in Wisconsin, education is a major issue. Thank goodness.
Yeah. I absolutely agree, and it's really, really good news. And I hope that Mr. Evers' ability to govern is not radically circumscribed, cut by the Wisconsin legislatures the Republicans are talking about right now. It'd be a terrible thing. Jim in Los Angeles. Jim, you got the last call of the day. What's up?
All right, my friend Tom. Thank you so much. First, I was advised...
And we just have 30 seconds, Jim, so be quick, please.
Okay, I would just like Bernie to hear he should announce that he's running for president now, so all of his speeches have to be covered. And also, real quickly, a ticket of Beto and Kamala Harris would be unbeatable and won for the Democratic Socialists.
Yeah. Jim, you don't have to...
the DSSS. Tom?
Yeah. Jim, thanks a lot for the call. I'm sorry we're out of time. Thanks so much for being with us today. I'll be back in Portland tomorrow and back on the air on Monday from our Portland studio. Again, thanks to The Nation, thenation.com today, ProPublica.org yesterday for lending me their conference rooms to do this show from, and really appreciate it. And thank you for being with us. And don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires you. So get out there, get active, tag, you're it. We'll see you on Monday. Have a great weekend.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit ThomHartmann.com.
From UN headquarters in